Before we drift off into the subtle hum of history's less urgent moments, consider perhaps a quiet moment to click that subscribe button for At Hollow Midnight. It helps us keep the whispers of forgotten eras flowing gently into your ears, ensuring a steady supply of tales so undramatic they might just bore you into a state of profound historical relaxation. 1. The arrival of the Black Death. The year was 1347, or thereabouts. Dates, one might observe, tend to blur when the world around you is dissolving into a rather unpleasant mist of illness and despair. It was a time when the very air seemed to hold a peculiar density, not quite perceptible to the untrained eye, but certainly felt in the sudden, unwelcome chill that crept into the bones of even the most robust merchant or the most devout priest. Europe, in its bustling, often unsanitary and perpetually superstitious way, was entirely unprepared for what was about to unfurl from the warm, often maligned lands of the East. Let us picture, if we can, the port of Messina in Sicily, a vibrant place, full of the clamor of trade, the smell of salted fish, stale wine, and the ever-present undertone of unwashed humanity. Ships arrived and departed with a rhythmic certainty, their masts scratching against the sky like skeletal fingers. And then, one day in October, a particular fleet of 12 Genoese galleys sailed to the harbor. They were not, it must be said, remarkable in their appearance. Just a collection of vessels, weathered by the sea, their sails perhaps a little tattered. But what they carried, unseen beneath their decks, was a cargo far more potent than spices or silks. It was a cargo of a very specific kind of quiet, a pervasive stillness that would soon envelop the entire continent. The sailors who disembarked were not, to put it mildly, in the peak of health. They were gaunt, with an unnatural pallor to their skin, and many coughed with a dry, hacking sound that seemed to scrape against the very air. Some were already covered in peculiar, dark swellings, the size of eggs or even apples, particularly in their armpits and groins. These lumps, ominously black in their centers, were called buboes, a word that would soon become as common as bread or water, and far more feared. The local authorities, with a fleeting and ultimately futile attempt at self-preservation, immediately ordered the ships out of the harbor. A rather sensible decision, one might think, but by then it was already akin to trying to close the barn door after the entire herd had not only bolted, but had already begun to reassemble themselves as a rather ill-tempered, purulent, and entirely unstoppable force of nature. The rats, of course, had already disembarked, and the fleas, those tiny, persistent engineers of biological devastation, had followed. They hopped from the fur of the scurrying rodents to the legs of unsuspecting dock workers, to the hems of cloaks, to the beds in inns, carrying with them the invisible, insidious germ that would soon be known as the Black Death. It was not a grand, dramatic invasion with trumpets and siege engines. It was an invasion of silence, of unseen movements, a biological whisper that quickly became a scream. Within days, the people of Messina began to fall ill. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent. A sudden fever, a terrible weakness followed by the appearance of those telltale buboes. Then, the black spots, the gods' tokens as some called them, appearing all over the body, marking the victim for a swift and agonizing end. Death usually arrived within 2 to 3 days, sometimes even within hours. The speed was the most shocking aspect. One could be fine at dawn, planning supper, and be a cold, stiff corpse by dusk. This rapidity was a particularly cruel twist, as it left no time for elaborate goodbyes, for confession, or even for much meaningful panic. It was just a stark, undeniable fact. Here one moment, gone the next. The initial reaction, as might be expected in a society steeped in an almost absurd degree of spiritual apprehension, was a flurry of desperate, frantic piety. People gathered in churches, praying, weeping, flagellating themselves in public displays of penance. They believed truly and deeply that this was divine punishment, a scourge from an angry God. Processions wound through the narrow, suddenly quieter streets, carrying holy relics, chanting litanies, hoping to appease a wrathful deity they felt they had somehow offended. Priests initially were overwhelmed with requests for last rites, their voices hoarse from endless blessings, their hands aching from holding so many crucifixes to so many dying lips. But the plague did not distinguish between the righteous and the sinner, the devout and the blasphemous. Priests fell ill as readily as prostitutes, saints as quickly as scoundrels. The sheer, indiscriminate nature of the dying began to chip away at the very foundations of these fervent beliefs. When your most pious neighbor, who had spent his life in prayer and charity, was taken just as swiftly as the notorious rogue from the tavern, the theological scaffolding began to wobble. If God was punishing them, then his criteria were either incomprehensible or simply non-existent. The number of dead began to swell beyond all comprehension. Grave diggers, those often overlooked but entirely essential members of any society, simply could not keep up. Trenches were dug, hastily and shallowly, then filled, then more trenches, then mass graves. The air, which had once smelled of fish and wine, now carried the heavy, sickening scent of decomposition, a smell that clung to clothing and hair, entering the lungs with every breath. The living were too few and too afraid to properly dispose of the dead. Bodies lay in homes, in streets, bloating under the indifferent sun, waiting for someone to overcome their fear and exhaustion to move them. Cities, once throbbing with life, became eerily silent in places, punctuated only by the occasional cry of a dying person, or the mournful tolling of a church bell, a bell that often stopped ringing abruptly as its ringer succumbed. Shops closed, not for holidays or market days, but because their owners and staff were dead or dying. Markets, once bustling centers of commerce and gossip, became desolate, the goods spoiling where they lay, unwanted and untouched. The intricate web of medieval society, with its guilds, its feudal obligations, its daily rituals of trade and interaction, began to unravel with terrifying speed. It wasn't a slow fraying, it was a sudden, violent tearing. People fled. Those who could gathered what meager belongings they could carry and fled from the contaminated cities to the countryside, hoping to escape the invisible enemy. But the plague, an impartial traveler, followed them. It seemed to move with the speed of thought, perhaps more accurately, with the speed of human contact. A single refugee, carrying the pestilence within their very breath, or on the fleas clinging to their worn clothes, could ignite an entire village. The countryside, initially seen as a safe haven, soon became just another vast graveyard. The initial shock gave way to a profound, bone-deep weariness. The fear was still there, certainly, a constant, gnawing presence. But it was overlaid with an exhaustion that seeped into every fiber of being. To bury your entire family, one after another, day after day, was not merely a tragedy. It was a physical ordeal. To wake each morning and wonder if this was the day the first bubo would appear. To watch your neighbor's lights go out. To hear the distant, dwindling cries. All this took a toll that went beyond simple grief. It was an existential fatigue, a weariness of the soul itself. The constant vigilance, the relentless despair, the sheer physical labor of survival and mourning, began to drain the people of Europe of their very capacity for complex thought or sustained emotion. The elaborate superstitious practices that had once been the bedrock of their daily lives, the endless prayers, the wearing of amulets, the specific rituals for warding off evil spirits or bad luck, the precise incantations for every ill, began to feel, to many, like an unbearable burden. When the world was falling apart, when the dead outnumbered the living, when the stench of death was a constant companion, when your own survival was a matter of pure, terrifying chants, who had the energy for complicated gestures or prolonged genuflections. The energy, frankly, was simply not there. The mind, battered by relentless horror, began to simplify, to shed the layers of complex belief that seemed to offer no protection anyway. The plague, it turned out, was not merely a physical disease. It was a psychological phenomenon of unparalleled magnitude. It did not just kill bodies, it attacked the very framework of meaning that medieval people had constructed around their lives. It showed them, with brutal clarity, that their meticulous rituals, their fervent prayers, their elaborate social hierarchies, and their deeply ingrained superstitions were, in the face of such an indiscriminate and overwhelming force, utterly useless. And in that realization, a new kind of tiredness began to settle in. A profound exhaustion that would eventually subtly, but fundamentally alter the human spirit and its relationship with the unseen. The age of unbridled energetic superstition was, quite literally, dying of exhaustion. The stages were set. The players were dying, and the stage itself was becoming a vast, silent charnel house, ready for the next, equally draining act. 2. A world drenched in omens before the black ships, before the peculiar swellings, before the very air turned thick with the scent of an unnatural silence. The world for the average inhabitant of medieval Europe was a place absolutely saturated with meaning. Every rustle of leaves, every twitch in an eyelid, every peculiar cloud formation was not merely a random occurrence, but a potential message, a whispered warning, or perhaps a divine nudge. Life, far from being a simple progression of days, was a constant, intricate dance of interpretation, a relentless search for omens in a universe believed to be brimming with them. It was, in its own way, a full-time intellectual endeavor, requiring a vigilance that would, in time, feel like an unbearable weight. Consider, if you will, the bustling, mud-streaked streets of any given village or town in, say, the early 1340s. A woman sets out for the market, perhaps to trade some eggs. Should a black cat cross her path, she would not merely sigh and walk on. No. A complex internal dialogue would immediately ensue. Was it a harbinger of ill luck for her trade? Should she turn back, perhaps say a specific prayer, or spit 3 times over her left shoulder? Or perhaps she should seek out a sprig of rosemary to tuck into her apron, a small piece of counter-magic to ward off the encroaching shadow. This was not a moment of fleeting fancy, but a genuine, internal calculation, weighing the potential risk against the effort of the protective ritual. The consequences of ignoring such a sign were believed to be dire, ranging from a spoiled sail to a sudden illness. The very animals, too, were unwitting participants in this grand cosmic ballet of prognostication. The hoot of an owl near a sick bed was not merely a nocturnal sound. It was a death knell. A flock of crows flying overhead in a particular formation might presage a coming storm, or even a battle. If a dog howled incessantly at the moon, it wasn't just expressing canine ennui. It was surely sensing the presence of unseen spirits, perhaps even the specter of death itself. People didn't just live alongside nature. They lived within its narrative, constantly reading its unspoken language, a language that spoke of fortune, misfortune, and the ever-present hand of the divine. The heavens above, of course, were the grandest theater for these celestial pronouncements. Comets, those fiery streaks across the night sky, were never just icy visitors from the outer reaches of the solar system. Oh no. They were blazing heralds of catastrophe, famines, wars, the fall of kings. When the great comet of 1345, or the one before it, or the one before that, appeared, it sent ripples of anxiety throughout the populace. Not because of its astronomical significance, which was utterly unknown, but because it was understood, implicitly and explicitly, as God's fiery finger pointing toward some impending doom. People would gather, murmuring, pointing, their faces etched with a peculiar blend of awe and dread, trying to decipher the specific message embedded in its tail or its trajectory. Was it a warning against gluttony? A sign of a coming pestilence? The interpretations were endless, and each offered a new layer of worry. Even the human body itself was a constant source of enigmatic signals. An itching palm, for instance, could mean money was coming, or perhaps a stranger was about to arrive. A sudden sneeze might be a sign that someone was speaking ill of you, or that a good omen was on its way, depending on the day of the week or the time of day it occurred. A twitch in the eye could indicate good luck, or betrayal. These weren't just old wives' tales, they were embedded in the very fabric of daily perception. To dismiss them was to risk inviting the very misfortunes they sought to predict or prevent. The body, it seemed, was merely another canvas upon which the cosmos painted its obscure, often unsettling, messages. The reasons for this pervasive preoccupation were, perhaps, rather straightforward, if tragically human. Life in the 14th century was, for most, a brutal, unpredictable affair. Disease, famine, violence, and sudden death were not abstract concepts. They were constant companions, lurking just beyond the threshold of every home. There was little understanding of germ theory, epidemiology, or meteorology. The causes of crop failure, of childhood mortality, of fevers that wasted bodies, were utterly mysterious. And where scientific understanding ends, speculation, and particularly spiritual explanation, rushes in to fill the void. It was far more comforting, in a bleak, perverse sort of way, to believe that misfortune was a punishment from an angry God, or the work of a spiteful demon, or the malicious curse of a disgruntled neighbor, than to accept that it was simply random, meaningless, and utterly beyond human control. The idea that everything happened for a reason, even if that reason was terrifyingly obscure, offered a semblance of order to an otherwise chaotic existence. It provided a framework, however flimsy, for explaining the unexplainable. It gave people a sense that they could, perhaps if they prayed hard enough, or performed the right ritual, or avoided the forbidden act, influence their destiny. So they armed themselves, not with steel and shield, for the most part, but with charms, amulets, and a rigorous adherence to ritual. A small leather pouch containing dried herbs, a fragment of a saint's bone, or a carefully scribed prayer might be worn around the neck to ward off illness or evil spirits. Specific prayers were recited for specific ailments, a prayer to Saint Christopher for safe travel, to Saint Apollonia for toothache, to Saint Roch for pestilence, a tragically ironic detail, as it would turn out. The very act of blessing one's bread before cutting it, or making the sign of the cross over a doorway, was a small daily act of cosmic protection, an attempt to weave a fragile shield against the relentless onslaught of misfortune. Even the simple act of visiting a new place, or starting a new venture, was often prefaced by consulting an astrologer or a local wise woman who could read the stars or interpret the patterns of nature. Which day was auspicious for a marriage? Which moon phase was best for planting? What did the dreams of last night truly signify? These were not considered trivial concerns, but vital pieces of information, guiding decisions both grand and mundane. The mind was perpetually engaged in this intricate, exhausting process of decoding, interpreting, and responding to a universe that seemed to communicate through an endless stream of subtle, often contradictory signals. This wasn't mere passive belief. It was an active, constant intellectual and emotional engagement. To live in medieval Europe was to be a perpetual detective, searching for clues, trying to piece together the grand, divine conspiracy that dictated one's fate. It required an immense amount of mental energy, a constant state of hypervigilance. Every unusual atmospheric event, every strange birth, whether human or animal, every sudden illness that befell a prominent figure, was scrutinized, debated, and assigned a place within the grand, bewildering narrative of signs and portents. The Church, while often at odds with the more pagan elements of folk superstition, nonetheless reinforced the fundamental idea that the world was a battlefield between good and evil, and that God's will was manifest in earthly events. Miracles were real, demonic possession was real, and divine punishment was a very tangible threat. This created a fertile ground where official theology and ancient folk beliefs intertwined, forming a dense, almost impenetrable thicket of spiritual interpretation. People weren't just believers, they were active participants in a vast ongoing cosmic drama, constantly looking for their cues, their warnings, their role. And so, when the Black Death arrived, sailing into Messina, it did not encounter a population of rationalists. Far from it. It encountered a people whose minds were already crammed, full of explanations for catastrophe. Accustomed to interpreting every misfortune as a divine message or a supernatural attack, they were ready for plague, in a sense in the way one is ready for a thunderclap after seeing lightning. They expected it to be a punishment for their sins, a visitation from an angry God, a trial of faith. They were prepared to interpret it through their existing complex and deeply ingrained frameworks of superstition and piety. They were ready for omens, for signs, for the desperate search for meaning. What they were not ready for, what their elaborate system of belief could not account for, was the sheer, indiscriminate, overwhelming, and utterly meaningless brutality of what was to come. That, as we shall see, would be a very different kind of test, and one that would expose the profound underlying fatigue of a world too long drenched in omens. 3. The first wave. Panic and prayers, the news, carried on the wings of frightened merchants, and the hoarse cries of fleeing villagers, spread across Europe not with the efficiency of a well-oiled communication network, but with the terrifying speed of contagion itself. From Messina, it hopped to Naples, then Florence, then Venice, then Marseille, then up the Aerne Valley, then into France, then across the Channel to England. And everywhere it landed. It struck a world already primed for cosmic disaster, a populace whose very intellectual landscape was built upon the interpretation of every creak, every shadow, every cough, as a profound, often malevolent, sign. Having lived for centuries in a state of perpetual vigilance against unseen forces and divine wrath, the initial knee-jerk reaction to the Black Death was not scientific inquiry, which was largely non-existent, nor public health measures, which were rudimentary and often too little, too late. No, the immediate, overwhelming response was a descent into a frantic, almost theatrical demonstration of piety and a desperate flailing at the well-worn, deeply ingrained mechanisms of spiritual appeasement. Imagine, if you will, the clamor. The very air began to vibrate, not just with the tolling of death bells, but with the collective rising hum of desperate prayer. Churches, which had always been central to communal life, became veritable fortresses of sound, packed to their very stone walls with supplicants. The usual quiet murmur of devotion was replaced by a cacophony of wails, sobs, and 1,000 overlapping litanies. People knelt on cold flagstones until their knees were raw, their hands clasped so tightly, their knuckles shone white, their eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot, fixed on crucifixes that seemed to offer less and less comfort with each passing day. They chanted the Idies Irae, the ancient hymn of judgment, not as a performance, but as a genuine, terrified plea for mercy from a God they suddenly perceived as immeasurably angry, his patience stretched beyond endurance. Priests, initially, were elevated to a position of even greater, almost impossible. Their services were sought ceaselessly. Last rites were administered not just once or twice a day, but dozens, hundreds of times, until their voices grew hoarse from blessings and absolutions, their arms ached from holding the crucifix to dying lips, and their minds reeled from the sheer volume of whispered confessions, sins small and large, real and imagined, poured out in a torrent of fear. They moved from bedside to bedside, from house to house, the grim procession of their duties only ending when they too succumbed to the same mysterious ailment, collapsing midway through a prayer, their vestments still clinging to the sweat of their final efforts. The irony was not lost on the increasingly cynical survivors. Even the chosen conduits of God's grace seemed no more immune than the most notorious sinner. Public processions became a daily, sometimes hourly affair. Flagellants, those self-appointed penitents, emerged from the corners of society, whipping themselves through the streets with leather scourges, tipped with iron spikes, their backs a bloody mess, their cries of mea culpa, echoing against the shuttered houses. They believed with a terrible, earnest conviction that by enacting such extreme public penance, they could somehow absorb the divine wrath, could perhaps, through their own suffering, atone for the collective sins of humanity and turn back the plague. Crowds would gather, initially in awe and hope, then in a growing horrified disbelief as these very same flagellants, their open wounds festering, would sicken and die, their fervent prayers ending in a black-spotted silence. The spectacle, meant to inspire piety and quell fear, instead became another grim testament to the plague's indifferent, unyielding march. Beyond the formal rituals of the church, the older, more ingrained superstitions of the common folk resurfaced with renewed, desperate vigor. Every available charm, every forgotten incantation, every obscure piece of folk wisdom was resurrected and applied with a frantic hope. People hung garlic cloves above their doorways, not for culinary reasons, but to ward off the bad air believed to carry the disease. Amulets, made of anything from carved wood to dried toad skin, were clutched tightly or worn openly, imbued with a desperate magical power to deflect illness. Spells were whispered into the night, invoking saints or spirits long abandoned by official dogma, hoping for some ancient, forgotten protection. Certain herbs, once used for mild ailments, were now consumed in vast quantities or burned as fumigants, their acrid smoke adding to the choking atmosphere, a futile attempt to purify air that was already irrevocably tainted. The desire to explain the unexplainable, so deeply ingrained from centuries of living in an omen-drenched world, reached a fever pitch. If God was punishing them, then for what specific sin? Every tremor of the earth, every unusual atmospheric phenomenon, every strange birth, and there seemed to be many in those anxious times, was scrutinized for its meaning, its precise message. Some blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells, leading to horrific pogroms that added human brutality to the natural one. Others blamed witches, leading to equally baseless accusations and trials. Yet others, often those with a more scientific bent for the era, blamed the conjunction of planets or peculiar astrological alignments, suggesting that the very stars were responsible for emanating a noxious influence. But no explanation, no scapegoat, no amount of desperate self-flagellation or ritualistic appeasement seemed to slow the inexorable tide of death. The failure was not gradual. It was brutally immediate and visually undeniable. One could watch a procession of flagellants, their backs bloody, their faces contorted in agony and prayer, only to hear a day or two later that half of them had succumbed. One could see entire families troop to church for Mass, overflowing with devotion, only to find their house dark and silent within the week, their bodies stiff and unburied. The most revered priests, the most devout nuns, the children of the most charitable lords, all fell. The plague showed no respect for piety, no deference to social standing, no pause for the completion of a final fervent prayer. It simply took, indiscriminately, relentlessly, and with a speed that left little room for processing, let alone strategizing. This relentless, brutal indifference began to erode the very foundations of the medieval mind's operating system. When every single, established method of coping, explaining, and warding off disaster not only failed but often seemed to accelerate the very doom it was meant to prevent. As infected people crowded together in churches, a profound disillusionment began to set in. The sheer physical and emotional exertion of constant prayer, constant ritual, constant public displays of piety began to feel meaningless, exhausting. Why expend the last reserves of one's energy crying out to a God who seemed utterly deaf, or performing rituals that yielded no discernible effect? The initial panic, a frantic, almost hyperactive response to unimaginable horror, slowly began to morph into something else. A deep, pervasive weariness. The screams of the dying became so common as to lose their shock value. The constant tolling of bells became an irritating drone. The sight of death carts rattling through the streets, piled high with corpses, became a daily, monotonous fixture. The act of mourning, of performing last rites, of burying the dead, became an endless, grueling chore, demanded of the living who were already teetering on the brink of their own demise. There was no time for elaborate wakes, no energy for prolonged grief. The living were too few, too overwhelmed, too terrified, and quite simply too tired. The collective mind of Europe, accustomed to finding profound meaning in every flicker of misfortune, found itself staring into a void of utter, inexplicable meaninglessness. This plague was not a warning, it was a wiping out. It was not a punishment that could be averted by specific repentance. It was an indiscriminate reaper. And as the bodies piled higher, as the stench of death permeated every corner, as the list of the departed grew to encompass nearly half, or even more, of the population in many areas, the very human capacity for sustained superstition began to dwindle, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The frantic prayers of the first wave, echoing against empty churches and silent homes, were the last. Desperate gasps of an intellectual framework that was, quite literally, dying of overexertion in the face of an enemy it could not comprehend and certainly could not appease. The stage was set, not for more frantic acts of faith, but for a profound, quiet collapse of the very impulse to believe. 2. A world drenched in omens before the black ships, before the peculiar swellings, before the very air turned thick with the scent of an unnatural silence. The world, for the average inhabitant of medieval Europe, was a place absolutely saturated with meaning. Every rustle of leaves, every twitch in an eyelid, every peculiar cloud formation was not merely a random occurrence, but a potential message, a whispered warning, or perhaps a divine nudge. Life, far from being a simple progression of days, was a constant, intricate dance of interpretation, a relentless search for omens in a universe believed to be brimming with them. It was, in its own way, a full-time intellectual endeavor, requiring a vigilance that would, in time, feel like an unbearable weight. Consider, if you will, the bustling mud-streaked streets of any given village or town in, say, the early 1340s. A woman sets out for the market, perhaps to trade some eggs. Should a black cat cross her path, she would not merely sigh and walk on. No, a complex internal dialogue would immediately ensue. Was it a harbinger of ill luck for her trade? Should she turn back, perhaps say a specific prayer, or spit 3 times over her left shoulder? Or perhaps she should seek out a sprig of rosemary to tuck into her apron, a small piece of counter-magic to ward off the encroaching shadow. This was not a moment of fleeting fancy, but a genuine internal calculation weighing the potential risk against the effort of the protective ritual. The consequences of ignoring such a sign were believed to be dire, ranging from a spoiled sail to a sudden illness. The very animals, too, were unwitting participants in this grand cosmic ballet of prognostication. The hoot of an owl near a sickbed was not merely a nocturnal sound, it was a death knell. A flock of crows flying overhead in a particular formation might presage a coming storm, or even a battle. If a dog howled incessantly at the moon, it wasn't just expressing canine ennui. It was surely sensing the presence of unseen spirits. Perhaps even the specter of death itself. People didn't just live alongside nature. They lived within its narrative, constantly reading its unspoken language, a language that spoke of fortune, misfortune, and the ever-present hand of the divine. The heavens above, of course, were the grandest theater for these celestial pronouncements. Comets, those fiery streaks across the night sky, were never just icy visitors from the outer reaches of the solar system. Oh no, they were blazing heralds of catastrophe. Famines, wars, the fall of kings. When the great comet of 1345, or the one before it, or the one before that appeared, it sent ripples of anxiety throughout the populace. Not because of its astronomical significance, which was utterly unknown, but because it was understood, implicitly and explicitly, as God's fiery finger pointing towards some impending doom. People would gather, murmuring, pointing, their faces etched with a peculiar blend of awe and dread, trying to decipher the specific message embedded in its tail or its trajectory. Was it a warning against gluttony? A sign of a coming pestilence? The interpretations were endless, and each offered a new layer of worry. Even the human body itself was a constant source of enigmatic signals. An itching palm, for instance, could mean money was coming, or perhaps a stranger was about to arrive. A sudden sneeze might be a sign that someone was speaking ill of you, or that a good omen was on its way, depending on the day of the week or the time of day it occurred. A twitch in the eye could indicate good luck or a betrayal. These weren't just old wives' tales. They were embedded in the very fabric of daily perception. To dismiss them was to risk inviting the very misfortunes they sought to predict or prevent. The body, it seemed, was merely another canvas upon which the cosmos painted its obscure, often unsettling, messages. The reasons for this pervasive preoccupation were perhaps rather straightforward, if tragically human. Life in the 14th century was, for most, a brutal, unpredictable affair. Disease, famine, violence, and sudden death were not abstract concepts. They were constant companions, lurking just beyond the threshold of every home. There was little understanding of germ theory, epidemiology, or meteorology. The causes of crop failure, of childhood mortality, of fevers and wasted bodies were utterly mysterious. And where scientific understanding ends, speculation, and particularly spiritual explanation, rushes in to fill the void. It was far more comforting, in a bleak, perverse sort of way, to believe that misfortune was a punishment from an angry god, or the work of a spiteful demon, or the malicious curse of a disgruntled neighbor, than to accept that it was simply random, meaningless, and utterly beyond human control. The idea that everything happened for a reason, even if that reason was terrifyingly obscure, offered a semblance of order to an otherwise chaotic existence. It provided a framework, however flimsy, for explaining the unexplainable. It gave people a sense that they could, perhaps, if they prayed hard enough or performed the right ritual or avoided the forbidden act, influence their destiny. So, they armed themselves, not with steel and shield, for the most part, but with charms, amulets, and a rigorous adherence to ritual. A small leather pouch containing dried herbs, a fragment of a saint's bone, or a carefully inscribed prayer might be worn around the neck to ward off illness or evil spirits. Specific prayers were recited for specific ailments. A prayer to Saint Christopher for safe travel, to Saint Apollonia for toothache, to Saint Roch for pestilence, a tragically ironic detail as it would turn out. The very act of blessing one's bread before cutting it, or making the sign of the cross over a doorway, was a small daily act of cosmic protection, an attempt to weave a fragile shield against the relentless onslaught of misfortune. Even the simple act of visiting a new place or starting a new venture was often prefaced by consulting an astrologer or a local wise woman who could read the stars or interpret the patterns of nature. Which day was auspicious for a marriage? Which moon phase was best for planting? What did the dreams of last night truly signify? These were not considered trivial concerns, but vital pieces of information, guiding decisions both grand and mundane. The mind was perpetually engaged in this intricate, exhausting process of decoding, interpreting, and responding to a universe that seemed to communicate through an endless stream of subtle, often contradictory signals. This wasn't mere passive belief. It was an active, constant intellectual and emotional engagement. To live in medieval Europe was to be a perpetual detective, searching for clues, trying to piece together the grand and divine conspiracy that dictated one's fate. It required an immense amount of mental energy, a constant state of hypervigilance. Every unusual atmospheric event, every strange birth, whether human or animal, every sudden illness that befell a prominent figure, was scrutinized, debated, and assigned a place within the grand, bewildering narrative of signs and portents. The Church, while often at odds with the more pagan elements of folk superstition, nonetheless reinforced the fundamental idea that the world was a battlefield between good and evil, and that God's will was manifest in earthly events. Miracles were real, demonic possession was real, and divine punishment was a very tangible threat. This created a fertile ground where official theology and ancient folk beliefs intertwined, forming a dense, almost impenetrable thicket of spiritual interpretation. People weren't just believers, they were active participants in a vast, ongoing cosmic drama, constantly looking for their cues, their warnings, their roles. And so, when the Black Death arrived, sailing into Messina, it did not encounter a population of rationalists. Far from it. It encountered a people whose minds were already crammed, full of explanations for catastrophe, accustomed to interpreting every misfortune as a divine message or a supernatural attack. They were ready for plague in a sense, in the way one is ready for a thunderclap after seeing lightning. They expected it to be a punishment for their sins, a visitation from an angry God, a trial of faith. They were prepared to interpret it through their existing, complex, and deeply ingrained frameworks of superstition, piety. They were ready for omens, for signs, for the desperate search for meaning. What they were not ready for, what their elaborate system of belief could not account for, was the sheer, indiscriminate, overwhelming, and utterly meaningless brutality of what was to come. That, as we shall see, would be a very different kind of test, and one that would expose the profound underlying fatigue of a world too long drenched in omens. The first wave, panic and prayers the news, carried on the wings of frightened merchants and the hoarse cries of fleeing villagers, spread across Europe, not with the efficiency of a well-oiled communication network, but with the terrifying speed of contagion itself. From Messina, it hopped to Naples, then Florence, then Venice, then Marseille, then up the Orne Valley, then into France, then across the Channel to England. And everywhere it landed, it struck a world already primed for cosmic disaster. A populace whose very intellectual landscape was built upon the interpretation of every creak, every shadow, every cough as a profound, often malevolent sign. Having lived for centuries in a state of perpetual vigilance against unseen forces and divine wrath, the initial, knee-jerk reaction to the Black Death was not scientific inquiry, which was largely non-existent, nor public health measures, which were rudimentary and often too little, too late. No, the immediate, overwhelming response was a descent into a frantic, almost theatrical, demonstration of piety and a desperate flailing at the well-worn, deeply ingrained mechanisms of spiritual appeasement. Imagine, if you will, the clamor. The very air began to vibrate, not just with the tolling of death bells, but with the collective, rising hum of desperate prayer. Churches, which had always been central to communal life, became veritable fortresses of sound, packed to their very stone walls with supplicants. The usual quiet murmur of devotion was replaced by a cacophony of wails, sobs, and 1,000 overlapping litanies. People knelt on cold flagstones until their knees were raw, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles shone white, their eyes, red-rimmed and bloodshot, fixed on crucifixes that seemed to offer less and less comfort with each passing day. They chanted the Ides, the ancient hymn of judgment, not as a performance, but as a genuine, terrified plea for mercy from a God they suddenly perceived as immeasurably angry. His patience stretched beyond endurance. Priests, initially, were elevated to a position of even greater, almost impossible, demand. Their services were sought ceaselessly. Last rites were administered not just once or twice a day, but dozens, hundreds of times, until their voices grew hoarse from blessings and absolutions. Their arms ached from holding the crucifix to dying lips, and their minds reeled from the sheer volume of whispered confession sins, small and large, real and imagined, poured out in a torrent of fear. They moved from bedside to bedside, from house to house, the grim procession of their duties only ending when they too succumbed to the same mysterious ailment, collapsing midway through a prayer, their vestments still clinging to the sweat of their final efforts. The irony was not lost on the increasingly cynical survivors. Even the chosen conduits of God's grace seemed no more immune than the most notorious sinner. Public processions became a daily, sometimes hourly, affair. Flagellants, those self-appointed penitents, emerged from the corners of society, whipping themselves through the streets with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes, their backs a bloody mess, their cries of mea culpa, echoing against the shuttered houses. They believed, with a terrible earnest conviction, that by enacting such extreme public penance, they could somehow absorb the divine wrath, could perhaps, through their own suffering, atone for the collective sins of humanity, and turn back the plague. Crowds would gather, initially in awe and hope, then in a growing horrified disbelief, as these very same flagellants, their open wounds festering, would sicken and die, their fervent prayers ending in a black-spotted silence. The spectacle, meant to inspire piety and quell fear, instead became another grim testament to the plague's indifferent, unyielding march. Beyond the formal rituals of the church, the older, more ingrained superstitions of the common folk resurfaced with renewed, desperate vigor. Every available charm, every forgotten incantation, every obscure piece of folk wisdom was resurrected and applied with a frantic hope. People hung garlic cloves above their doorways, not for culinary reasons, but to ward off the bad air believed to carry the disease. Amulets made of anything from carved wood to dried toadskin were clutched tightly or worn openly, imbued with a desperate magical power to deflect illness. Spells were whispered into the night, invoking saints or spirits long abandoned by official dogma, hoping for some ancient forgotten protection. Certain herbs, once used for mild ailments, were now consumed in vast quantities or burned as fumigants, their acrid smoke adding to the choking atmosphere, a futile attempt to purify air that was already irrevocably tainted. The desire to explain the unexplainable, so deeply ingrained from centuries of living in an omen-drenched world, reached a fever pitch. If God was punishing them, then for what specific sin? Every tremor of the earth, every unusual atmospheric phenomenon, every strange birth, and there seemed to be many in those anxious times, was scrutinized for its meaning, its precise message. Some blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells, leading to horrific pogroms that added human brutality to the natural one. Others blamed witches, leading to equally baseless accusations and trials. Yet others, often those with a more scientific bent for the era, blamed the conjunction of planets or peculiar astrological alignments, suggesting that the very stars were responsible for emanating a noxious influence. But no explanation, no scapegoat, No amount of desperate self-flagellation or ritualistic appeasement seemed to slow the inexorable tide of death. The failure was not gradual. It was brutally immediate and visually undeniable. One could watch a procession of flagellants, their backs bloody, their faces contorted in agony and prayer, only to hear a day or two later that half of them had succumbed. One could see entire families troop to church for Mass, overflowing with devotion, only to find their house dark and silent within the week, their bodies stiff and unburied. The most revered priests, the most devout nuns, the children of the most charitable lords, all fell. The plague showed no respect for piety, no deference to social standing, no pause for the completion of a final fervent prayer. It simply took, indiscriminately, relentlessly, and with a speed that left little room for processing, let alone strategizing. This relentless, brutal indifference began to erode the very foundations of the medieval mind's operating system. When every single, established method of coping, explaining, and warding off disaster not only failed, but often seemed to accelerate the very doom it was meant to prevent. As infected people crowded together in churches, a profound disillusionment began to set in. The sheer physical and emotional exertion of constant prayer, constant ritual, constant public displays of piety began to feel meaningless, exhausting. Why expend the last reserves of one's energy crying out to a God who seemed utterly deaf, or performing rituals that yielded no discernible effect? The initial panic, a frantic, almost hyperactive response to unimaginable horror, slowly began to morph into something else. A deep, pervasive weariness. The screams of the dying became so common as to lose their shock value. The constant tolling of bells became an irritating drone. The sight of death carts rattling through the streets, piled high with corpses, became a daily, monotonous fixture. The act of mourning, of performing last rites, of burying the dead, became an endless, grueling chore, demanded of the living who were already teetering on the brink of their own demise. There was no time for elaborate wakes, no energy for prolonged grief. The living were too few, too overwhelmed, too terrified, and quite simply, too tired. The collective mind of Europe, accustomed to finding profound meaning in every flicker of misfortune, found itself staring into a void of utter, inexplicable meaninglessness. This plague was not a warning. It was a wiping out. It was not a punishment that could be averted by specific repentance. It was an indiscriminate reaper. And as the bodies piled higher, as the stench of death permeated every corner, as the list of the departed grew to encompass nearly half, or even more, of the population in many areas, the very human capacity for sustained superstition began to dwindle, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The frantic prayers of the first wave, echoing against empty churches and silent homes, were the last, desperate gasps of an intellectual framework that was, quite literally, dying of overexertion in the face of an enemy it could not comprehend and certainly could not appease. The stage was set, not for more frantic acts of faith, but for a profound, quiet collapse of the very impulse to believe. For Drenched, the exhaustion of the divine, the initial, almost theatrical outburst of fervent prayer and public penance had, in its own way, consumed an immense amount of collective spiritual energy. It was a massive, communal outpouring of desperate hope, an attempt to throw every available resource of piety at an enemy that defied comprehension. But hope, even when divinely inspired, has a finite supply, especially when met with relentless, crushing failure. As the first wave of the Black Death raged, consuming entire families, decimating villages, and laying waste to bustling cities, a new kind of silence began to fall over Europe, one far more unsettling than the cessation of daily clamor. It was the silence of disillusionment, the quiet resignation of spirits utterly spent. Imagine for a moment the local priest, Father Thomas, in a small French village. In the early days, his church would have been overflowing, His voice, though hoarse, would have been a beacon of hope and guidance. He would have heard confessions until his ears rang, offered last rites until his arm ached, and preached sermons of repentance with an urgent, desperate fire. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that these acts were efficacious, that God, in his infinite mercy, would respond to such earnest supplication. But then, day after day, week after week, the burials continued. His most devout parishioners, those who spent hours prostrate before the altar, were taken. The sweet, innocent children he had baptized, who surely carried no sin, succumbed. His fellow priests, robust men of God, choked on their last breath midway through a blessing. And then, one morning, Father Thomas himself would feel the familiar, dreadful chill, the sudden weakness, the first telltale bubo swelling in his armpit. He would have prayed, perhaps with the last vestiges of his strength, but the prayer would have been cut short. His faith, perhaps, a flickering ember in the face of absolute, incomprehensible indifference. His death, like that of countless others in holy orders, was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a profound blow to the very concept of divine intervention. If the chosen conduits, those who spoke directly to God, were abandoned, what hope was there for the rest? The very concept of divine wrath began to lose its terrifying edge, replaced instead by a kind of weary bewilderment. If this plague was a punishment for sin, then surely the scale was wildly disproportionate. And if God was punishing everyone indiscriminately, then what was the point of striving for virtue? The theological scaffolding, once so sturdy, began to creak and groan under the weight of so many unburied dead. The intricate logic that tied suffering to sin and mercy to piety began to unravel. It was simply too much to reconcile. The effort of maintaining such a complex theological framework, of perpetually seeking out the specific transgression that had brought such a generalized doom, became an intellectual burden too heavy to bear for minds already reeling from unimaginable loss and physical exhaustion. The meticulous, often arduous, practice of identifying and interpreting omens also began to falter under this crushing weight of reality. When death was everywhere, when every breath felt like a potential portal for the unseen killer, what specific meaning could be drawn from a black cat crossing one's path, or an owl hooting at midnight? Every twitch, every shadow, every unusual cloud formation, every sneezing fit, had in the past been a call to action, a signal to perform a specific ritual, or say a particular prayer. But now, the signal was always the same. Death, the fine distinctions, the nuanced interpretations, the very energy required to assign meaning to every mundane event in a world already saturated with signs, simply dissolved. When every omen pointed to the same inevitable conclusion, the intricate art of omen reading became utterly redundant. One did not need a hooting owl to know that death was near. One needed only to step outside or listen to the dwindling silence of the neighbors' houses. Consider the practicalities, the daily rhythm of life, once punctuated by prayers for good harvest, rituals for safe childbirth, charms against minor ailments, was utterly shattered. Who had the time to meticulously apply poultices of blessed herbs when the entire household was sick or dying? Who had the energy to undertake a lengthy pilgrimage to a distant shrine when simply carrying the dead out of one's home was a monumental, terrifying task? The physical demands of survival became so overwhelming that the more abstract, time-consuming rituals of appeasement and protection fell by the wayside, not out of defiance, but out of sheer, bone-deep, overwhelming tiredness. The very act of performing these rituals became yet another exhausting chore in a life already overflowing with them. The collective despair also drained the capacity for sustained communal action in the name of piety. The flagellant processions, initially inspiring awe and a flicker of hope, quickly devolved into grim, silent exercises, their participants often collapsing from exhaustion, infection, or both. These spectacles, once meant to demonstrate unwavering faith and perhaps move God to pity, became stark, miserable affirmations of the plague's indifference. The energy required to whip oneself bloody, to march for miles, to chant tirelessly, was simply not sustainable when one was already weak from hunger, grief, and the ever-present fear of contagion. The physical toll of these extreme acts of devotion became a greater threat than any perceived sin. Moreover, the sheer volume of death made traditional funerary rites impossible. The elaborate ceremonies, the days of mourning, the careful burial in consecrated ground, all these were cornerstones of medieval belief about the afterlife and the peace of the soul. But now bodies were simply shoveled into mass graves, often without the presence of a priest, sometimes not even with a proper shroud. The dead accumulated faster than they could be processed, their silent reproach a constant reminder of the failure of the spiritual framework. If the dead could not be properly honored, if their souls could not be properly commended to God, then what was the point of all the prayers for the living? This logistical nightmare chipped away at the spiritual solace previously offered by structured grief. This was not a sudden intellectual rejection of God or the Church. Not for the most part. It was a profound, pervasive weariness that seeped into the very marrow of society. It was the exhaustion of shouting into a void, of performing elaborate dances for an audience that seemed not to care, or perhaps was simply not there. The people were not necessarily becoming atheists, but they were becoming quite profoundly indifferent. They were too tired to pray with conviction, too tired to search for meaning in every twitch and shadow, too tired to perform rituals that had so demonstrably failed. The constant threat, the endless grief, the sheer physical and mental burden of survival had simply drained them of the energy required to maintain such an elaborate, demanding relationship with the divine and the supernatural. The world had always been to them a vast, complex machine of signs and divine intentions. Now, it felt like a broken, arbitrary thing, spewing forth death without pattern or purpose. And faced with such an overwhelming display of cosmic meaninglessness, the medieval mind, once so eager to interpret, so ready to appease, began to simply shut down. It was a mental and spiritual fatigue, a quiet, almost imperceptible surrender. The divine had, it seemed, exhausted itself, or perhaps more accurately, the human capacity for believing in its active, benevolent intervention had simply run out of steam, leaving behind a stark, quiet emptiness, fertile ground for a new, weary kind of realism. 5. The practicality of survival, the cacophony of desperate prayers, the fervent self-flagellation, the endless ringing of bells that marked a passing Sulol. These had, by the peak of the Black Death's first relentless sweep, begun to fade into a weary, almost imperceptible drone. The collective spiritual energy of Europe, once so boundless in its capacity for belief and ritual, had simply, utterly run dry. It wasn't a sudden, defiant rejection of the divine, or a philosophical uprising against the Church. No, it was far more mundane and far more profound. It was an exhaustion so deep it seeped into the very marrow of society, draining away the capacity for sustained mysticism. When every elaborate prayer, every tearful pilgrimage, every meticulously performed exorcism against the bad humors or demonic influences resulted only in more corpses, more desolation, and more of that omnipresent stench, the human spirit, quite simply became too tired to maintain the charade. The mind, battered by relentless horror, began to shed the layers of complex, often futile, spiritual gymnastics, turning instead, with a groan of profound weariness, towards the most basic, most immediate, and most starkly practical concerns. How to not die, and how to make the dying slightly less awful for those left behind. consider the simple act of fleeing. In the early days, fleeing was often interpreted as a lack of faith, cowardly avoidance of God's judgment. But as it became devastatingly clear that those who remained huddled in crowded churches, fervently praying, died at an exponentially higher rate than those who bolted for the countryside, a certain grim, undeniable logic began to assert itself. It was not a reasoned understanding of contagion, certainly not, but a visceral empirical observation. Proximity equaled death. Distance, however slight, offered a whisper of hope. So people fled. They left behind their homes, their possessions, their dying relatives, not because they suddenly disbelieved in divine punishment, but because the alternative was immediate, certain death. There was no time, no energy, for the moral agonizing that such abandonment might have once entailed. The decision was no longer a spiritual one, but a biological imperative, raw and unadorned. This nascent, desperate pragmatism manifested in various, often crude ways. One of the earliest, and perhaps most enduring, was the concept of isolating the sick. When a person showed the dreadful signs, the fever, the buboes, the black spots, the reaction was no longer to gather around them for communal prayer, but to retreat. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. Sometimes the sick were simply left to their fate, a grim mercy in itself. Entire households became sepulchres, their inhabitants sealed within, their last cries muffled by brick and timber. In cities, nascent forms of what would later be called quarantine began to emerge, driven not by epidemiological theory, but by the sheer, terrifying visibility of death. Ships arriving from plague-ridden ports were turned away or forced to anchor offshore for days, sometimes weeks, on the desperate, unarticulated hope that the sickness would simply exhaust itself before disembarking. The city gates, once open arteries of commerce, became points of rigid, fearful control, admitting only those who could prove, however superficially, their freedom from the plague's grip. These measures were imperfect, often cruelly applied, and frequently too late. But they represented a profound shift from the reliance on intercession to the enforcement of physical boundaries. Then there was the overpowering, undeniable problem of the dead. The sheer volume of corpses exceeded any previous experience or logistical capacity. The ground was littered with them. Houses brimmed with silent, stiff forms. The air, already heavy with the miasma of fear, grew thick with the cloying, sickly sweet scent of decomposition. This was not an abstract theological problem. It was an immediate, nauseating, and utterly undeniable assault on the senses. And so, the living, however few and however weary, had to act. Gravedigas, those humble, often disdained figures, became the unlikely heroes, or perhaps the grim backbone of this new practical age. They worked until they dropped, digging enormous, shallow pits, mass graves, into which bodies were tossed with little ceremony, often uncoffined, sometimes without even a priest to say a final word. The old, intricate rituals of burial, the respectful shrouds, the solemn processions, these were luxuries the plague-ridden world could no longer afford, not because people ceased to believe in their importance for the soul, but because the sheer physical effort of adhering to them was simply impossible. Survival demanded shortcuts, grim and unholy as they might seem. The concept of bad air, or miasma, while scientifically incorrect as a primary cause of disease, nonetheless spurred pragmatic actions that had some incidental benefits. People began to burn aromatic woods and herbs, frankincense, rosemary, juniper in their homes and in the streets. This wasn't necessarily a prayer to specific deities, but an attempt to purify the air, to make it breathable, to mask the omnipresent stench of death and decay. While the smoke didn't kill the bacteria, it forced people to open windows, to ventilate spaces, and perhaps subconsciously encouraged a rudimentary form of cleaning the immediate environment by removing the most offensive sensory elements. Filth, always a feature of medieval cities, was suddenly seen not just as an aesthetic problem, but as a tangible manifestation of the badness that invited sickness. Efforts, however crude, were made to clear refuse from streets, to avoid stagnant water, to generally make the immediate surroundings less repugnant. It was a cleanliness born of terror and a desire for immediate relief, rather than a scientific understanding of pathogens. But it was cleanliness nonetheless. The breakdown of established hierarchies also inadvertently fostered this practicality. With so many priests, doctors such as they were, and local officials dying, the traditional sources of guidance and comfort dwindled. People were forced to rely on their own observations, their own desperate common sense. If prayer didn't work, and the priest was dead, then what else could one do? The answer, increasingly, became to observe what seemed to work for others, even if it was just fleeing to a new place, or isolating a sick family member, or burying the dead quickly. This was the birth of a rudimentary, experiential epidemiology, born not of intellectual curiosity, but of brute necessity. The irony, of course, was that many of these practical measures were still deeply intertwined with pre-existing beliefs. Quarantine was often justified not by germ theory, but by the idea that sick people emanated a contagious breath or a poisonous humor. Sanitation was about warding off miasma, not bacteria. But the crucial shift was that the actions were physical, tangible, and directly observable in their, however limited, effects. Spitting over one's shoulder or wearing an amulet provided no tangible effect. Moving to a less crowded village, or burning effigies of garlic, at least felt like doing something. The sheer physical exertion involved in these new forms of coping replaced the mental and spiritual exhaustion of the old. It was a different kind of weariness, certainly, but it offered a different kind of hope. The hope that one's own immediate physical efforts might, just might, make a difference. This was the slow, painful birth of a pragmatic outlook, forged in the crucible of unparalleled suffering and profound fatigue. The endless veiled supplications to the divine had, quite literally, worn people out. They were too tired to interpret complex omens, too tired to sustain elaborate rituals, too tired to maintain fervent, yet unrewarded, faith. What little energy they had left was channeled into simple, desperate acts of self-preservation, however brutal or unscientific. The shift was not a deliberate intellectual revolution, but a slumped, exhausted sigh towards whatever seemed to make the dying stop, or at least made the air slightly less putrid. The era of energetic, vibrant superstition was slowly, agonizingly, giving way to the stark, unglamorous, and often horrifying practicality of survival. 6. The absurdity of blame. The human mind, in its peculiar and often rather endearing way, abhors a vacuum, especially a vacuum of meaning. When the world collapses, when every established pattern of life shatters, when death becomes the default state rather than the unfortunate exception, the desperate need to find a Gaia reasons, each cause, culprits, swells to an almost unbearable pressure. Before the exhaustion settled in, before the very capacity for sustained outrage withered under the relentless onslaught of dying, there was a frantic, often darkly humorous period of blame. For a brief, terrifying interval, Europe engaged in a grand, continent-wide game of pointing fingers, a desperate attempt to externalize the incomprehensible horror by assigning it to something, anything, other than random, unmanageable fate. It was an intellectual exercise in futility, certainly, but one undertaken with the frenetic energy of a condemned man, desperately digging for an escape tunnel with a blunt spoon. The most convenient, and tragically familiar, target for this collective angst were, of course, the minorities. The Jews, perennial outsiders often existing in segregated communities, speaking a different tongue, adhering to different customs, were the first and most savagely attacked. The whispers began subtly, carried on the panicked breath of the terrified. The wells, it was said, had been poisoned. The Jews, in their malicious cunning, had conspired to destroy Christendom. Such accusations, ancient and venomous, found fertile ground in a populace already convinced that God's wrath was upon them, and eagerly seeking a tangible, earthly agent for that divine displeasure. Imagine the sheer raw energy poured into this hatred. The town criers, their voices hoarse, proclaiming the supposed perfidy. The mobs, fueled by fear and ignorance, descending upon Jewish quarters, their faces contorted with a righteous fury that belied the terror gnawing at their souls. Entire communities were put to the torch, their inhabitants massacred, often with a horrifying public spectacle, as if the very act of burning a few dozen or a few hundred innocent souls could somehow incinerate the plague itself. The irony, bitter and profound, was that these atrocities, far from stemming the tide of death, often accelerated it, as the movement of people and the breakdown of order provided fresh avenues for the pestilence to spread its indiscriminate rot. But for a time, the act of blaming, of having a tangible enemy to despise and punish, provided a temporary terrible release, a focus for the otherwise diffuse horror. It was a kind of furious, albeit misplaced, spiritual exertion. Foreigners, too, came under immediate suspicion. A merchant from another city, a pilgrim from a distant land, even a wandering minstrel with an unfamiliar accent, could suddenly find themselves the target of fearful glares and hushed accusations. They carried the bad air, perhaps, or the evil eye. They had brought the plague with them, these strange, unknown entities. The instinct to blame the other was strong, especially when the familiar world was crumbling. City gates that had once welcomed trade and travel now eyed newcomers with a deep existential dread. Even the wind, that invisible and entirely blameless force, came under scrutiny. The bad air, or miasma, was a persistent theory, leading to the belief that certain winds, carrying the pestilential breath from infected regions, were to blame. People would shut windows, burn foul-smelling herbs, and even change the direction of their beds, all in a desperate, ultimately futile attempt to deflect an atmospheric enemy. It was a kind of collective, atmospheric paranoia, a vast abstract scapegoat in the very air they breathed. Animals, those mute companions and unwitting vectors, also became targets for the blame game, albeit in a different, more nuanced way. Cats, long associated with witchcraft and the arcane, were often viewed with suspicion, their nocturnal habits and quiet stealth easily interpreted as malevolent. In some areas, campaigns were launched to exterminate them, a decision that, with the grim foresight of hindsight, only exacerbated the problem by allowing the true culprits, the rats, to proliferate unhindered. Dogs, too, were sometimes killed, perceived as unclean or as harbingers of ill omen. The very flies and fleas, though their role was completely unknown, were surely part of the general uncleanliness that invited the pestilence. The sheer energy expended on this low level, often disorganized extermination of anything deemed unclean or suspicious was yet another testament to the desperate need to egidio something, anything, to exert some control over an utterly uncontrollable reality. The intellectual elite of the era, the learned doctors and astrologers, while not engaging in mob violence, offered their own, equally absurd, yet more complex, theories of blame. The alignment of planets, the malevolent influence of distant stars, the peculiar conjunctions of celestial bodies, these were invoked as the ultimate culprits, the grand cosmic architects of humanity's suffering. Pamphlets and treatises, filled with elaborate diagrams and convoluted astrological calculations, were produced, attempting to explain, to rationalize, to assign responsibility to the heavens themselves. It provided a certain high-minded intellectual comfort, perhaps, to attribute the disaster to such grand impersonal forces, removing it from the realm of human sin or divine caprice. But for the average person struggling to bury their dead and avoid their own demise, such abstract explanations offered little solace or practical guidance. They merely added another layer to the immense, bewildering intellectual burden of living through the end of the world. Yet, as the plague continued its relentless, indiscriminate sweep, the very energy required for this elaborate, often violent, game of blame began to wane. The atrocities against the Jews, horrific as they were, did not stop the plague. The killing of cats did not stop the plague. The burning of aromatic herbs did not stop the plague. The planets continued their indifferent dance. No matter who or what was blamed, the death carts continued their grim rattle, the church bells tolled, and then often fell silent. The sheer scale of the dying, the ubiquitous nature of the horror, began to drain the very capacity for sustained hatred and blame. When half your village is dead, when your own family is decimated, when survival itself is a daily miracle, the energy for persecuting the other simply runs out. There was no time for elaborate conspiracy theories when one was too weak to carry water. There was no room for furious pogroms when the remaining able-bodied were needed to dig mass graves. The emotional labor of maintaining such intense animosity, of performing the rituals of accusation and punishment, became just another unsustainable burden in a world where every action had to be distilled to its most basic, immediate necessity: staying alive. The absurdity of blame, initially a frantic, almost theatrical, attempt to impose meaning on chaos, eventually collapsed under its own weight, and the crushing reality of the plague's indifference. It was not a grand epiphany, not a sudden realization of shared humanity, but a slow, weary, and deeply cynical capitulation. The people of Europe were simply too tired to hate with conviction, too exhausted to sustain the elaborate narratives of villainy, too overwhelmed to engage in anything beyond the immediate, desperate struggle for existence. The collective wellspring of outrage, like the wellsprings of prayer and superstition, had simply dried up, leaving behind a stark, quiet exhaustion where even the satisfying release of blame seemed like an effort far too great to bear. The scapegoats remained, perhaps, in the back of the mind, but the energy to pursue them, to punish them, to even carry about them, had utterly vanished, lost in the pervasive, suffocating fog of fatigue. 7. The silence of the graveyards after the desperate, futile frenzy of prayer, and the brief, equally futile and often horrific outburst of blame. A new kind of quiet began to settle over the shattered landscape of Europe. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping village, nor the reverent hush of a church service. No, this was a profound, suffocating silence, born of exhaustion and the sheer, overwhelming presence of death. Nowhere was this silence more palpable, more chilling than in the graveyards, or rather the places that had become graveyards, whether consecrated or not. These were no longer sacred plots, neatly arrayed with crosses and humble stones, awaiting the measured toll of a single bell for a departed soul. They were vast, open wounds on the earth, brimming with a horror that defied both description and, crucially, imagine, if you will, a churchyard. Before the plague, it might have been a small, contained space, perhaps bordered by a low stone wall, where the village dead rested in orderly rows. The soil, over centuries, had grown rich with human remains, a testament to generations. Now it was a charnel house. The neatly dug graves had quickly given way to shallow pits, then to vast, sprawling trenches, dug by a diminishing number of ever more weary hands. These trenches were filled not with individual bodies carefully laid to rest, but with jumbled, anonymous piles of corpses, often naked, sometimes partially devoured by dogs or rats, their limbs tangled in a grotesque embrace. Lime, if it could be found, was thrown over them, a futile attempt to mask the stench and halt the decay. But even this exhausted effort often failed, leaving the raw earth to simply swell and putrefy under the indifferent sun and rain. The air in these places, and often for miles around them, was no longer merely tainted. It was thick, cloying, and undeniably putrid. It was the smell of decay, of corruption, of humanity rapidly returning to dust, magnified 1,000-fold. This omnipresent stench was a constant, visceral assault, a heavy blanket that smothered any finer sensibilities. It clung to clothes, to hair. It seeped into the very pores of the living, becoming a part of their very existence. And in the face of such a tangible, overwhelming reality of rot and dissolution, the more abstract, subtle fears of the supernatural began to lose their grip. Consider the pre-plague anxieties about improper burial. The unhallowed dead, the suicide, the unbaptized infant, these were figures of immense spiritual dread. Their souls were believed to wander restlessly, unable to find peace, perhaps returning as revenants to torment the living, or trapped in a purgatorial limbo. The meticulous rituals of a Christian burial, the washing of the body, the dressing in a shroud, the solemn procession, the blessing of the grave, the careful placement in consecrated ground, the final prayers commending the soul to God were not mere customs. They were absolutely vital acts, ensuring the eternal peace of the departed and the safety of the living. To deny these rites was to invite spiritual catastrophe. But when the plague came, this entire elaborate framework collapsed. There was no time, no energy, and often no living priest left to perform the rites. Bodies were taken from homes by cart, or even by wheelbarrow, sometimes dragged by ropes, and unceremoniously dumped into the communal pits. Families who had traditionally guarded their dead with immense care found themselves abandoning their loved ones on the streets, or sealing them within their homes, too terrified or too weak to face the inevitable infectious reality of the corpse. The very concept of unhallowed ground became a grim joke. The entire land was unhallowed. Every field, every patch of forest, every riverbank became a potential resting place for the unmourned, unblessed dead. And as the numbers of the improperly buried swelled, something peculiar happened to the collective psyche. The intense, specific fear of the individual wandering ghost, the vengeful revenant, began to dissipate. Not because people suddenly disbelieved in them, but because the sheer, overwhelming scale of potential spectral activity rendered the concept meaningless. If every person who died without proper rites became a ghost, then the entire world would be teeming with them, a chaotic, invisible multitude. The idea of a single angry spirit rattling chains or moaning outside a window became almost quaint in the face of a continent where millions had died without a prayer. If the afterlife was now simply a cosmic traffic jam of dislocated souls, then the individual haunting lost its unique terror. It became, in a morbid, exhausted way, the new normal. The silence that accompanied this saturation of death was profound. The usual sounds of life, the chatter of children, the clang of the blacksmith, the murmur of market stalls, the singing of hymnshad vanished in many places, replaced only by the buzzing of flies and the distant, increasingly rare creak of a death cart. The church bells, which had once tolled ceaselessly, marking every passing soul, now often hung silent, their ringers having succumbed, or the remaining able-bodied too few and too weary to pull their heavy ropes. The graveyard no longer echoed with the soft sobs of mourners or the murmured prayers of a priest. It hummed with the flies and the soft, unsettling sound of earth being turned, often by a single, exhausted individual, and the occasional, guttural cough of someone who knew their turn was coming. This quiet, this overwhelming presence of death was a numbing agent of unparalleled power. The constant sensory input of decay, the endless visual reminders of mortality, the sheer, crushing weight of loss stripped away the capacity for nuanced fear. Why fear a demon when death itself walked so plainly among you? Why worry about a witch's curse when a bubble could appear overnight without any discernible cause? The immediate, undeniable reality of the plague dwarfed all other, more abstract terrors. The complex hierarchy of spiritual dangers and the intricate rituals meant to ward them off seemed utterly trivial, even ridiculous in the face of such a universal, indiscriminate reaper. The very concept of sacred space began to erode. Churches, once sanctuaries, became places of intense infection where crowded supplicants only spread the disease more rapidly. Graveyards, once hallowed ground, became pits of anonymous horror. The efficacy of holy water, of relics of blessings, was brutally disproven by the constant, unyielding march of death through every supposedly protected space. If God's chosen places offered no protection, then what hope was there in a blessed amulet or a specific prayer against a bad omen? The people, those few who remained, were simply too tired to maintain the elaborate mental architecture of superstition. Their minds, battered into submission by the relentless spectacle of death, sought simplicity. The energy once spent on interpreting omens, performing counter-rituals, or fearing specific ghostly visitations was now entirely consumed by the raw, unglamorous struggle for basic survival. To find food, to stay warm, to avoid the sick, to simply see and breathe them, without the constant fear of contagion. These were the new, all-consuming tasks. The thought of an unquiet spirit rising from a mass grave seemed less terrifying than the next wave of fever, less urgent than the dwindling supply of clean water. The silence of the graveyards, therefore, was not merely an absence of sound. It was the sound of a world that had ceased to believe, not in God necessarily, but in the intricate, demanding, and ultimately futile dance of appeasement and interpretation that had defined their lives for centuries. It was the quiet of a spirit utterly drained, a mind too weary to entertain the complex terrors of the supernatural when the real, tangible terror was so overwhelmingly present. The sheer scale of death had numbed them, not to feeling perhaps, but certainly to the energetic, imaginative engagement with the unseen world. All that remained was a grim, quiet resignation, and the pervasive, undeniable smell of earth and dissolution. 8. The rise of the skeptics, the silence of the graveyards, a morbid symphony of buzzing flies and distant guttural coughs, was not merely an absence of sound. It was the chilling, undeniable proof of a profound internal shift. The frantic clamor of prayers had faded. The wild, desperate energy of blame had sputtered out, leaving behind a Europe not so much in open rebellion against its spiritual heritage, but simply, profoundly, and quite wearily, in this numbness, this existential fatigue that permeated the very air, a tiny flickering ember of something new began to smolder. It was not a grand intellectual revolution, nor a widespread philosophical movement. It was far more subtle, born of repeated observation and a cynicism so deep it bordered on a kind of bleak, fatalistic humor. This was the quiet, almost imperceptible rise of the skeptics, individuals who, through sheer, unadorned experience, found themselves stripped bare of their once vibrant superstitions, left with only the stark, undeniable irony of the plague's indiscriminate nature. Consider for a moment the village stonemason, a man named Gerald. For 40 years, Gerald had carved crosses and inscriptions, always with a careful, reverent hand, believing deeply in the sanctity of the blessed ground and the power of a properly entered body to find peace. He had seen priests offer last rites to the dying, had witnessed the solemnity of funeral processions, and had himself recited countless Ave Marias over fresh graves secure in the knowledge that these rituals were not merely customs, but vital guarantees for the soul's journey. But then came the plague. He watched as Father Ulrich, a man of profound piety who had spent his life in prayer and service, succumbed just as swiftly as old drunken Barnaby from the tavern, whose life had been a continuous string of blasphemies and petty crimes. Gerold, now almost alone in his trade, found himself shoveling bodies dozens, hundreds into hastily dug mass pits, often without a priest, sometimes without even a shroud. He saw the bodies of infants, unbaptized, tossed alongside those of the most devout nuns. The intricate theological distinctions, the careful spiritual hierarchies that dictated who went to heaven, who to purgatory, and who to hell, began to dissolve in his mind, replaced by the simple brutal reality of the pit. What did it matter if a soul was blessed or unblessed when all flesh became the same putrid mass? The sheer physical exhaustion of his work, coupled with the relentless visual evidence of the plague's utter indifference to spiritual standing, left him too tired for theological wrestling. His skepticism wasn't reasoned argument. It was a profound, weary sigh, a shrug of the shoulders that conveyed more than 1,000 sermons ever could. The effort of believing in such a meticulously ordered, yet demonstrably chaotic, divine plan was simply too much. This quiet, observational skepticism also seeped into the daily lives of the common folk, manifesting in small, almost unnoticeable ways. Old Agnes, who had for decades kept a specific sprig of dried rowan wood above her door to ward off witches, watched as her neighbor, who had publicly scorned all such heathen practices, survived, while her own family, every one of them, perished despite their adherence to every known charm and counterspell. The amulet that young Thomas had worn around his neck since birth, blessed by 3 different priests and rumored to contain a sliver of a saint's bone, did not prevent the telltale bobo from erupting in his armpit, nor did it slow his agonizing descent into fever and death. The specific prayers for specific ailments, once recited with such earnest conviction, began to feel like hollow incantations. Why pray to Saint Sebastian for protection from plague when Saint Sebastian's own shrine was now surrounded by the dying, and the very priests who championed him were dead? The cognitive dissonance, the mental gymnastics required to maintain belief in the face of such overwhelming contradictory evidence, became simply too exhausting. It was easier, far easier, to simply conclude that the charm didn't work, that the prayer was unheard, that the saint was either powerless or indifferent. This wasn't a philosophical breakthrough, but a simple, almost instinctive, practical concession to brutal reality. The mind, once so eager to interpret every twitch and shadow as an omen, now just saw a shadow, or perhaps nothing at all. The irony, sharp and bitter, became a constant, if unspoken, companion. Consider the vast sums of money, the countless hours, the immense physical effort that had gone into building cathedrals, commissioning relics, and funding pilgrimages, all meant to secure divine favor and protection. Now, these very structures, these very objects, offered no more defense than a mud hut. Indeed, the crowded conditions in churches, initially seen as sanctuaries of communal prayer, often became hotbeds of infection, inadvertently accelerating the plague's spread among the most pious. The irony was so profound, so devastating, that it almost bordered on dark humor. One could almost hear a grim chuckle from the surviving few, saying they spent our lives building altars and performing penance, only to find death lurking in the very pews. The effort spent on spiritual appeasement now seemed like a grotesque waste, an exhausting distraction from the raw, unglamorous struggle for actual survival. Even among the surviving clergy, a quiet, almost imperceptible cynicism began to take root. Those priests who had somehow weathered the storm, often by abandoning their flocks or barricading themselves away, were not necessarily abandoning their faith in God, but they were certainly re-evaluating their faith in the G mechanisms of their faith. The performative aspects, the rituals, the intermediaries, they had failed. When a priest had administered last rites to hundreds, only to see them die anyway. When he himself had been spared while his more devout brethren succumbed. It inevitably led to a profound, weary questioning of divine logic. They might continue to preach, but the fire, the fervent conviction, had often been replaced by a hollow echo, a practiced recitation. The energy for impassioned spiritual leadership was simply not there. Having been utterly consumed by the relentless, thankless task of burying the dead and surviving another day, their continued existence, often inexplicable, became its own quiet statement against the neat narratives of piety and punishment. The flagellants, those self-appointed scourges of divine wrath, who had once been met with awe and fearful hope, became objects of weary pity, and then, often, simply ignored. Their agonizing, bloody rituals, once seen as a powerful form of intercession, now seemed like a futile, physically draining exercise. When half of a flagellant procession collapsed from the plague, their open wounds festering, their self-inflicted suffering achieving nothing but hastening their own demise, the entire spectacle lost its power. The survivors, too tired to cheer, too tired to condemn, simply watched with dull, lifeless eyes as the parade of misery passed by. The physical effort involved in such extreme forms of penance was simply unsustainable in a world where every ounce of energy was needed for basic survival. The absurdity of blame, which had briefly provided a furious outlet, also faltered. When the Jewish communities had been massacred, and the plague continued unabated, the energy for further persecution dwindled. The act of blaming itself was an exhausting pursuit, requiring a level of sustained emotional and intellectual engagement that the survivors simply no longer possessed. This skepticism was not always vocal, nor was it necessarily articulated in grand terms. It was more a silent, internal acknowledgement of futility. People continued to attend church, perhaps, if a priest was left alive and able-bodied enough to hold a service. They might still mutter a prayer or wear a charm, but the fervent conviction, the raw, demanding energy that had once fueled these practices, had been drained away. It was a kind of passive disbelief, born not of intellectual superiority, but of profound weariness. The mind, having grappled with incomprehensible horror, having witnessed the repeated, undeniable failure of every known protection, simply retreated into a quieter, more pragmatic space. It was too tired to conjure new elaborate explanations for the inexplicable, too tired to maintain the old ones that had so demonstrably failed. The very concept of a meticulously ordered, omen-drenched universe, where every event carried a divine message and every ritual held specific power, buckled under the weight of so many meaningless deaths. The plague's indifference, its brutal democracy, revealed the ultimate emptiness of a world saturated with conditional truths. If the most pious perished alongside the most wicked, if the sacred and the profane dissolved into the same putrid mass, then what was the point of all the painstaking distinctions, all the exhausting rituals, all the endless interpretation? The answers to the exhausted mind seemed to be there was no point. And in that bleak, quiet realization, the foundations of energetic superstition began to crumble, not with a bang, but with a weary, almost inaudible sigh, leaving behind a profound emptiness that future generations, perhaps less tired, would attempt to fill with new meaning. The stage was now set for a world where the practical, however crude, began to quietly, wearily eclipse the purely spiritual. 9. The Plague Doctor's dark comedy, as the initial, almost hyperactive flurry of panic and prayer subsided into a dull, pervasive ache, and the frenetic energy of blame collapsed under its own weight, the shattered landscape of Europe began to accept a new, grim normality. In this weary quietude, where even the ghosts seemed too tired to properly haunt, a peculiar figure began to stride through the dying towns and villages. A walking, breathing embodiment of the era's misplaced hope and its ultimate heartbreaking absurdity. This was the plague doctor, not always a formally trained physician, but often a civic appointee, a desperate hire, whose very appearance was a macabre, almost satirical comment on the limits of human understanding and the enduring, yet exhausting, grip of superstitious belief. Imagine, if you will, the sight. It was a silhouette lifted straight from a nightmare, or perhaps a particularly grim Punch and Judy show. A long, dark, waxed leather coat, often ankle-length, designed, it was believed, to prevent the bad air from clinging to the fabric. Beneath this, thick breeches and sometimes gloves of the same treated leather. But the true masterpiece of this peculiar ensemble, the part that instantly seared itself into the memory of any terrified bystander, was the headpiece. A leather hood covered the entire head, giving way to a large conical beak, like that of a bird, perhaps 18 inches long. Inside this beak, stuffed with aromatic herbs such as mint, camphor, cloves, myrrh, or even ground unicorn horn, for the truly ambitious and well-funded physician, was the supposed filter against the pestilential miasma. Glass eye holes, often clouded with sweat and grime, allowed the wearer to dimly perceive the dying world around them. In one hand, this bizarre apparition often carried a long wooden stick, which was not merely a walking aid, but served a dual, equally baffling purpose: to point at afflicted areas on the patient without making direct contact, and more entertainingly to push back the desperate crowds of onlookers who might, in their terror, try to grasp at the doctor's seemingly protective garments. This elaborate costume, a testament to a combination of rudimentary medical theory and fervent belief in the power of scent and physical barriers, was, in its essence, another grand ritual, another desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. It was a performance, a reassurance to the terrified populace that i.e. something was being done, that expertise, however bizarrely manifested, was on hand. The very act of donning the suit was a kind of daily exorcism, a personal commitment to engaging with the very substance of death. And yet, for all its theatricality, for all its impressive, almost intimidating appearance, the methods employed by these walking anachronisms were, for the most part, entirely futile, often painful, and sometimes, tragically, hastened the very demise they were meant to prevent. Their primary tools, beyond the scented beak, often included sharp lances for opening the buboes, those ominous egg-sized swellings in the armpits and groins. The prevailing medical theory of humors dictated that these swellings were a sign of the body's attempt to expel the disease, and therefore lancing them would assist in this purification. This procedure, agonizingly painful and inevitably leading to further infection, was performed with a grim conviction, even as the patient writhed in agony and almost invariably worsened. Bloodletting, too, was a common practice, the removal of bad blood another attempt to balance the body's humors, leading to further weakness in already debilitated patients. Potions and concoctions, often made from strange exotic ingredients or common herbs mixed with urine or feces, were administered with equal solemnity, their efficacy resting entirely on the desperate hope of the patient and the lingering, albeit rapidly fading, belief in some underlying magical principle. The dark humor in this grim spectacle was subtle, born of exhaustion, but pervasive. Here was a figure, clad in what amounted to a medieval hazmat suit, performing rituals no more effective than burning garlic, yet invested with the authority of science and civic appointment. To the average citizen, who had seen their entire family disappear despite endless prayers and every known charm, the arrival of this beaked figure, with his absurd remedies and even more absurd attire, might have initially sparked a flicker of hope. But as the familiar pattern repeated the visit, the lancing, the potion, the inevitable, swift death, that flicker quickly extinguished, replaced by a weary recognition of yet another failed intervention. The plague doctor became less a healer, and more a grim reaper in fancy dress, a theatrical herald of the inevitable. This repeated failure, played out in thousands of sick beds across the continent, slowly but inexorably eroded any remaining belief in the efficacy of such elaborate, outwardly impressive, yet fundamentally useless practices. The sight of the plague doctor, once perhaps inspiring awe, or at least a fearful respect, became just another dreary, monotonous fixture of the dying world. His arrival no longer sparked fervent prayer or renewed hope, but a quiet, almost cynical resignation. Here he comes again, one could almost hear the weary survivors think. Another set of bizarre rituals, another round of pain, another body for the pit. Why, the energy for even believing in the pretense, for investing any emotional or spiritual capital in this costume charade, was simply not there. The elaborate costume itself began to embody the futility. It was a monumental effort of craftsmanship and belief, yet it offered no more protection than a peasant's woolen tunic against the invisible killer. The carefully chosen herbs in the beak, meant to ward off the bad air, were just pleasant-smelling foliage in the face of a bacterial scourge. The glass eyes, designed for sight, often obscured the reality of impending death, or reflected the dying light from vacant eyes. It was all so much work, so much expense, so much effort for absolutely no discernible gain. The sheer waste of resources and energy on such grand, yet ultimately pointless, endeavors added another layer to the collective fatigue. The plague doctors, therefore, became unwilling symbols of the exhaustion of superstition. They were the very last, most desperate attempt to apply elaborate, ritualistic, and largely magical thinking to a problem that demanded a new, pragmatic, and ultimately scientific approach. Their very existence underscored the medieval mind's relentless need to ritualize, to externalize, to personify the threat, even if that personification involved a man in a leather bird mask poking buboes with a stick. But as their failures mounted, as their patients continued to die with frightening regularity, the spectacle of their efforts ceased to be awe-inspiring or even terrifying, and became merely tedious, then pathetic, and finally just another part of the pervasive, numbing exhaustion, nibtidan. The sustained mental effort of trying to believe, of trying to hope, of trying to interpret the meaning behind the plague doctor's bizarre actions and futile remedies, drained away. People were too tired to be impressed, too tired to be shocked, too tired to even fully despair at this final costumed charade of medical intervention. The plague doctor's dark comedy played out on a stage littered with corpses, to an audience too weary for laughter, too weary for tears, too weary for anything but a quiet, almost imperceptible shrug. And in that shrug, born of profound weariness and the brutal clarity of repeated failure, the last vestiges of energetic superstition began to quietly, inevitably fade, leaving behind only the cold, hard ground of stark reality. The age of the grotesque, the absurd, and the deeply futile had run its course, leaving behind a silence that was less about piety and more about profound, bone-deep, spiritual and intellectual exhaustion. 10. The luxury of fear, the initial shriek of terror that had erupted across Europe with the arrival of the Black Death, had by now softened, dulled, and finally largely dissipated into a low, pervasive hum of resignation. It was not that fear had entirely vanished, for the sharp prickle of immediate danger, the sudden chill of a fever, or the sight of a new bubbo forming on one's own skin could still evoke a primordial dread. But the luxury of sustained, all-encompassing, frantic terror had, for the most part, become something only the recently afflicted or the tragically naive could still afford. For the hardened survivors, those who had buried entire families, witnessed unspeakable horrors, and walked daily through landscapes of death, the capacity for such intense, metabolically demanding emotion had simply and quite mercifully withered. Consider the nature of true panic. It is a violent, explosive force, consuming vast reserves of energy. It demands the entire focus of the mind, every nerve screaming, every muscle tensed for flight or fight. In the early days of the plague, this panicked, frantic prayers, the desperate flight, the violent scapegoating, the ceaseless ringing of death bells was everywhere. It was a continent-wide nervous breakdown, a raw, exposed nerve. But how long can a body, a mind, a society sustain such an intense, exhausting state? Not long. It turns out, when the very act of existing becomes a physical and emotional ordeal, when every day brings more loss and more grim tasks, the system simply cannot afford the continuous expenditure of such high-octane emotional fuel. The body, worn thin by grief, hunger, and the constant threat of infection, simply ran out of the capacity to properly fear. The sheer, overwhelming scale of death was the ultimate numbing agent. When a single death occurred in a village, it was a tragedy, a shock, a source of profound grief and fear. When a dozen died, it was a disaster. But when half or two-thirds or even three-quarters of a town's population simply ceased to be, when every street became a silent testament to absence, when the air itself was thick with the omnipresent stench of decay, the human mind began to shut down its more complex emotional responses. Each new corpse was no longer a fresh horror, but merely another addition to an already impossible tally. The individual, unique terror of death, once a powerful motivator for elaborate rituals and fervent prayers, became diluted, almost mundane, in the face of such relentless, indiscriminate universality. One could no longer be shocked, for shock required a deviation from the norm, and death was now the suffocating norm. The nuanced, terrifying fear of specific supernatural entities, which had once powered so much of medieval superstition, also faded under this blanket of exhaustion. Why maintain a constant vigil against a mischievous imp or a vengeful witch when the very air seemed to hold a more potent, more immediate, and utterly inescapable enemy? The carefully delineated anxieties about succubi, incubi, or the wandering souls of the unbaptized, which had once consumed so much mental energy in warding spells and counter-rituals, now seemed quaint, almost a quaint luxury. Who had the mental space to fret about a demon in the night when a very real, very physical death could claim you before dawn? The intellectual effort of discerning a specific omen, of interpreting a particular sign, and of responding with the appropriate superstitious action became an unbearable burden. When every sign pointed to death, the entire system of prognostication became redundant. The mind, once a busy factory of interpretation and spiritual calculation, now merely grunted, its processing power reduced to the bare essentials of sensory input and immediate threat assessment. This wasn't a brave, defiant loss of fear, but a weary, almost apathetic resignation. It was the emotional equivalent of a besieged castle running out of arrows, then food, then water, until the defenders simply sit down, too tired to fight, too tired to even hope for rescue. The grand, theatrical gestures of piety had given way to the grim, practical necessities of survival. But even these practicalities became infused with a deep, bone-weary fatalism. If one could escape, one did. If one could bury the dead, one did. But if one could not, if the plague found you, then there was little left but a quiet, almost indifferent surrender. The terror had been burned out, leaving only ash and the chilling cold of acceptance. Consider the daily routine for a survivor. Wake up if you did, and check for the signs. No buboes. A small momentary reprieve. Then find food, often scarce and overpriced. Avoid the sick, if you could tell them from the merely starving. If someone in your household developed the symptoms, the scream of terror was now often replaced by a heavy sigh, a shared, silent acknowledgement of the inevitable. The frantic rush to a priest, if one was still alive and willing to risk contagion, was replaced by a quiet vigil, perhaps a few mumbled prayers, and then the grim, physically draining task of removing the body. Each of these acts, once imbued with profound emotional weight, became a series of monotonous, repetitive chores. The capacity for intense emotional response, for a full-bodied, all-consuming fear, had been replaced by a kind of functional numbness, a necessary psychological defense mechanism against perpetual trauma. The very landscape became a mirror of this emotional exhaustion. The once bustling streets, now silent, did not evoke terror so much as a heavy sadness, a desolate emptiness. The constant sight of empty homes, of abandoned workshops, of overgrown fields, spoke not of an active threat, but of a quiet, unyielding attrition. The absence, the void, was far more pervasive than any specific terrifying presence. And in this pervasive absence, the mind found little to actively fear. It was like standing in a vast, empty room. There might be a lurking shadow, but the sheer emptiness itself was the overwhelming sensation. The traditional horrors of the medieval imagination, the fire of hell, the gnashing of teeth, the eternal damnation for unconfessed sins, began to lose their vivid potency. When death was so immediate, so agonizing, and so universally distributed, the abstract terrors of the afterlife seemed almost secondary, a problem for another day, if such a day ever arrived. The immediacy of the physical bubo, the fever, the agonizing breath, overshadowed any theological anxieties about one's eternal fate. The energy to maintain such a complex system of spiritual fear, to constantly assess one's moral ledger against the backdrop of an angry God, was simply not available. The mind had been stripped bare, its priorities reduced to the brutal simplicity of survival in the here and now. This wasn't to say that all fear vanished. The healthy still feared becoming sick, the living feared becoming dead. But it was a quieter, more internal, less performative fear. It was a fear that manifested as a constant low-grade anxiety, a background hum rather than a shrieking crescendo. It was a fear that drove pragmatic action, fleeing, isolating, cleaning rather than frantic, ritualistic appeasement. The energy for the performancy of fear, for the grand gestures of terror and piety, was gone. What remained was a grim, private, and deeply weary recognition of vulnerability. The survivors were not fearless. They were simply too tired to be terrified. They had exhausted their capacity for active dread, traded it for quiet, almost clinical resignation. The luxury of fear, that vibrant, demanding emotion that had once fueled so much of their superstitious world, had been consumed by the relentless, indiscriminate march of death, leaving behind only the cold, hard, and utterly unsuperstitious reality of an emptied world. The vibrant tapestry of omens, spirits, and divine judgments had been shredded, not by intellectual argument, but by the dull, persistent grind of survival. All that remained was the quiet, almost indifferent hum of a populace too weary to care about anything beyond the next breath, or the lack thereof. 11. The abandoned rituals. The world, for the medieval mind, had always been a densely woven tapestry of cause and effect, where every creak of a floorboard, every sudden shiver, every flight of a bird held profound significance, demanding a precise ritualistic response. Life was not merely lived, but constantly navigated through a minefield of potential spiritual pitfalls and divine judgments, each requiring its own specific charm, prayer, or carefully performed gesture. This intricate system of superstitions, however, required an immense, almost tireless, amount of mental and physical energy to maintain. It was a full-time job for the soul, a perpetual engagement with the unseen forces of the cosmos. But then came the Black Death, a cosmic event of such overwhelming, indiscriminate brutality that it simply and quite literally tired people out. The boundless wellspring of human energy once devoted to upholding this elaborate spiritual architecture simply ran dry, leaving behind a stark landscape of abandoned rituals like forgotten tools rusting in a deserted workshop. Consider, if you will, the daily morning rituals that once defined so many lives. Before venturing out, a peasant might have made the sign of the cross over his plow, or whispered a quick prayer to Saint Isidore the laborer. A merchant, before opening his stall, might have furtively spat 3 times to ward off the evil eye of a jealous competitor, or touched a specific good luck charm tied to his belt. A woman, preparing the morning meal, might have blessed the bread, invoking protection against unseen spoilage or ill humors. These were not grand theatrical performances, but ingrained, almost unconscious habits, small, reassuring acts of cosmic housekeeping that affirmed their place in a divinely ordered, albeit perilously balanced world. But when the plague arrived, when the act of simply waking up and finding oneself still alive became the day's primary accomplishment, who had the energy for such precise, subtle gestures? The bread would be eaten, blessed or not. The stall would open, or more likely, remain closed, evil eye or no. The plow would sit idle in the field, its owner long dead. The sheer physical and emotional exhaustion of daily survival simply squeezed out the capacity for these delicate, energy-consuming niceties. The elaborate framework of funerary rites, once so paramount for the peace of the soul and the comfort of the living, was one of the first and most visibly abandoned. Before the pestilence, a proper Christian burial was an affair of immense spiritual and social weight. The body would be meticulously washed, dressed in its best clothes or a clean shroud, laid out for a wake, often attended by neighbors and family offering prayers and lamentations. A priest would perform last rites, hear confession, and preside over a solemn procession to the consecrated churchyard, where the body would be carefully interred, often in a familial plot marked by a cross. Psalms would be sung, prayers recited, and the earth, blessed and holy, would receive the departed. But with the plague, this entire, intricate dance of grief and piety simply collapsed. Bodies were stacked in carts, often naked, indistinguishable from one another. There were no clean shrouds, no solemn processions, no time for wakes. Priests, if they were even alive, were overwhelmed, their voices hoarse, their hands numb from blessing 1,000 dying lips before they themselves fell. The concept of consecrated ground became moot when every patch of earth was a mass grave. The energy required for such meticulous reverence, for proper mourning, had simply been consumed by the raw, immediate horror. The living were too few, too weak, too terrified, and above all, too tired to provide anything beyond the most perfunctory disposal of the dead. The traditional fear of unquiet spirits or restless souls, once so potent a driver for proper burial, dwindled into a kind of weary indifference. If every unburied corpse was a potential revenant, the world would be swarming with them. And who had the energy to fight 1,000,000 ghosts when one could barely lift a spade? Pilgrimages, once a grand expression of faith and penance, also became a relic of a less exhausted age. Before the plague, a journey to a distant shrine, to Canterbury, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela, was a momentous undertaking, requiring months of planning, considerable expense, and immense physical endurance. These arduous journeys were undertaken to seek miraculous cures, to atone for grievous sins, or to give thanks for divine favor. They were acts of profound spiritual effort, a strenuous, physical manifestation of fervent belief. But as the plague swept across the land, transforming every road into a potential death trap, every town into a hotbed of contagion, and every shrine into a place where the sick congregated and died, the very idea of a pilgrimage became an act of suicidal folly. Who would risk their remaining precious breath for a journey that seemed more likely to end in a mass grave than a spiritual epiphany? The energy, both physical and mental, required for such an undertaking was simply unimaginable to a populace whose every movement was now dictated by the desperate need to avoid infection. The spiritual ambition had been crushed by the grim practicality of survival. The meticulous observance of omens, once a constant, almost intellectual pursuit, also withered. Before the plague, a twitch in the left eye might mean money was coming, but a twitch in the right might mean betrayal. The hoot of an owl might signal death, but the sighting of a robin might promise good fortune. Every natural phenomenon, every animal's cry, every bodily sensation was parsed and interpreted, demanding a specific counter-ritual or a moment of reflection. This relentless search for meaning, this constant decoding of the universe's subtle messages, was an energy-intensive endeavor. But when the message was always, relentlessly, uniformly, death, the subtle distinctions became pointless. What did it matter if a black cat crossed your path when thousands of people were dying daily, regardless of the feline population's movements? The mind, battered into submission by unrelenting horror, lost its capacity for such fine-tuned interpretative work. It was too tired to bother with subtle hints when the sledgehammer of reality was crushing everything. The energy for intellectualizing misfortune, for creating elaborate symbolic structures, had been utterly drained. Even the more extreme forms of public piety, such as the flagellant movements, which had briefly surged with terrifying energy in the early days of the plague, ultimately succumbed to this pervasive exhaustion. The act of whipping oneself bloody, marching for miles, and chanting ceaselessly was an immense physical undertaking, requiring a level of sustained fanaticism that the human body simply could not maintain under the duress of widespread famine, disease, and fear. When the flagellants themselves began to sicken and die in their bloody rags, their self-inflicted wounds festering, the spectacle lost its power to inspire either awe or terror. It became a grim, pitiful, and ultimately pointless display of wasted energy. The energy for even witnessing such a performance, let alone participating in it, evaporated. The countless specific charms, amulets, and superstitious objects, once so carefully crafted, blessed, and worn, began to be discarded or simply ignored. The small leather pouch containing dried herbs, the fragment of a saint's bone, the carefully inscribed prayer on parchmental, were powerless against the buboes. The belief in their efficacy, once so robust, had been ground down by repeated, undeniable failure. It was not an intellectual rejection, but a kind of practical, weary disillusionment. Why bother with the painstaking collection of ingredients, the precise incantation, or the careful wearing of an item, when its supposed power was so demonstrably null? The energy involved in maintaining and believing in these small, personal acts of magic was a luxury that few could still afford. The mind, too tired to summon the conviction, allowed these practices to simply fall away. The very act of blaming, once a furious, energy-consuming process that fueled pogroms and accusations, also lost its impetus. While prejudice might have remained, the sustained energy for organized persecution, for witch trials or massacres, dwindled. When the perceived culprits, Jews, witches, foreigners, continued to die just as indiscriminately as everyone else, and the plague showed no signs of abating after their punishment, the logical, or rather illogical, justification for the violence withered. The physical effort of rounding up suspects, conducting trials, and enacting gruesome punishments was too great for a population decimated by illness and focused on basic survival. The energy for maintaining such elaborate narratives of villainy, for fueling collective outrage, had simply been consumed by the more pressing, immediate, and utterly exhausting demands of burying the dead and finding food. The abandoned rituals, therefore, were not discarded in a grand gesture of defiance or enlightenment. They simply faded, like old tapestries left exposed to the sun and rain. They were casualties of a profound collective fatigue. The human spirit, faced with an enemy it could not comprehend, reason with, or appease, chose not to fight, but to simply collapse under the weight of its own exhaustion. The elaborate, energy-consuming dance with the divine and the supernatural had ended, leaving behind a stark, quiet world where the practical, however grim, slowly and wearily began to assert its dominance over the fantastical. All that remained were the chilling echoes of once fervent prayers, now silenced by the overwhelming, unanswerable question of why. Wealth. The irony of the aftermath, the great silence, heavy and pervasive, eventually settled across the land, though it was a silence punctuated by the eerie whisper of wind through abandoned homes and the unsettling absence of the familiar clamor of human life. The Black Death, having swept through Europe with a terrible, indifferent efficiency, left behind a world transformed, a landscape scarred not just by mass graves and deserted fields, but by an even deeper, more profound, and perhaps ironically, more mundane shift in the collective human spirit. The initial shriek of terror, the frantic, almost theatrical displays of piety, the brief, furious spasm of blame had by now exhausted themselves. What remained was a populace too weary to resurrect the old fears with their former vigor, too spent to re-engage with the intricate, demanding dance of superstition that had once defined their very existence. Consider the air itself in the aftermath. It no longer vibrated with the ceaseless tolling of church bells, for often the bell ringers were gone, or the bells themselves were cracked from overwork, or simply the living were too few and too tired to pull the ropes. The pervasive stench of death, though perhaps slightly diminished by the passage of time and the efforts of scavengers, lingered as a faint, insidious memory, a phantom odor in the back of the throat. This physical weariness, this lingering assault on the senses, was thus matched by an even deeper spiritual and intellectual fatigue. The human mind, having been stretched beyond its capacity for grief, horror, and frantic explanation, had simply mercifully entered a state of dull, resigned numbness. The sheer, undeniable failure of every known remedy, every fervent prayer, every carefully observed omen, every desperate charm, had imprinted itself on the collective consciousness with an indelible clarity. How could one, with any remaining conviction, tie a red string around a child's wrist to ward off fever, when 10 red strings had failed to save its siblings? How could one embark on an arduous pilgrimage for a miraculous cure, when the very roads to the shrines were littered with the bodies of those who had died trying? The elaborate, energy-intensive rituals that had once been the bedrock of daily life now seemed not just futile, but almost ludicrous. A cruel joke played by a seemingly indifferent cosmos. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain such beliefs in the face of absolute, unyielding failure was simply too exhausting a burden for minds already reeling from unimaginable loss. This was the profound irony of the aftermath. The very catastrophe that, by all medieval logic, shouldn't have plunged humanity deeper into a desperate, all-encompassing fear of the divine and the supernatural, instead drained away the very energy required for such intense engagement. When the most pious and the most sinful perished with equal terrifying speed, the intricate theological justifications for divine punishment began to fray. If God was truly angry, his wrath was so indiscriminate, so vast, that individual acts of penitence seemed laughably small, utterly inconsequential. Why bother with intricate confessions or self-flagellation or fasting, when the outcome was demonstrably the same regardless? The effort, the mental and physical exertion involved in these acts of appeasement was simply too much for a populace whose remaining vitality was devoted to the stark, unglamorous struggle for continued existence. The once vibrant tapestry of omens and portents also lay in tatters, disregarded not out of intellectual defiance, but out of sheer, bone-deep weariness. When every hoot of an owl, every twitch of an eye, every strange cloud formation could only signify one thing: death, or the lingering memory of it, the nuanced art of interpretation became pointless. The universe, once a grand book of divine messages, had been reduced to a single repetitive, horrifying sentence. and who had the energy to read a book with only one word, repeated endlessly. The mind, battered by relentless reality, ceased to look for meaning in every shadow, every fleeting sound. It was simply too tired to care. Consider the practicalities of a depleted world. Labor was scarce, brutally so. Fields lay fallow, workshops stood empty, trade routes were choked by fear and lack of manpower. The survivors, those gaunt figures who now wandered through the silent towns, had no time, no surplus energy, for the elaborate social dances of superstition. A woman who spent her days scrounging for firewood and burying her husband, her children, her parents, and her neighbors had no remaining strength to fuss over a dropped knife, or to perform a specific ritual before churning butter. The immediate, tangible needs of food, shelter, and avoiding the lingering illness consumed every last ounce of their being. The abstract terror of a mischievous spirit or the remote possibility of a witch's curse seemed a distant, almost quaint concern when compared to the very real, very present fear of starvation or the return of the sickness itself. Even the memory of fear had been diluted by its omnipresence. The initial, sharp pang of dread had been replaced by a kind of low-grade, constant anxiety, a dull ache that lingered in the background, but rarely flared into full-blown panic. This was not a courageous lack of fear, but a functional numbness, a necessary psychological adaptation to a world where death was no longer an exception, but a constant, almost mundane, companion. One could not remain in a state of shrieking terror indefinitely. The human psyche simply could not sustain it. And with the ebbing of intense, active fear came the ebbing of the rituals designed to appease it. The very institutions that had once championed and formalized many superstitions also suffered irreparable damage. The church, while it would eventually recover, was decimated. Priests, monks, and nuns died in vast numbers. Monasteries became charnel houses. The loss of learned clergy meant the loss of institutional memory, of the precise theological arguments that supported certain practices, and of the very people who performed and transmitted the complex rituals. The social infrastructure that enforced and encouraged many superstitious behaviors had been shattered. It was not a deliberate dismantling, but a collapse born of attrition, leaving gaps that the weary survivors had no energy to fill. And so, in the quiet, desolate landscape of the aftermath, the traditional, energy-intensive superstitions lay abandoned, not out of intellectual enlightenment, but out of profound, bone-deep weariness. The world was still full of mystery, still full of things that could not be explained, but the human capacity for elaborate, demanding, and ultimately fruitless explanations had simply run out. The survivors were too tired to resurrect the demanding rituals, too tired to maintain the complex narratives of blame, too tired to find meaning in every twitch and shadow. What little energy they had was poured into the basic, brutal mechanics of survival, into rebuilding, however slowly, a fragmented world. The irony was palpable. The greatest spiritual challenge humanity had faced in centuries did not deepen its faith in the old ways, but instead inadvertently wore it out, leaving behind a stark, quiet emptiness where the sheer, unglamorous practicality of life now wearily held sway. The grand, exhausting dance with the divine had concluded, leaving only a lingering echo, a memory of a time when people had the luxury of being truly, passionately, and energetically superstitious. 13. The lingering shadows, the profound, heavy silence that had settled over Europe in the wake of the Black Death was not, it must be understood, an absolute, enduring quiet. Nor was the widespread exhaustion and cynical indifference a permanent state of affairs. The human mind, in its peculiar, persistent way, abhors a vacuum, especially a vacuum of meaning, while the initial fervent energies of prayer, blame, and frantic ritual had been utterly consumed by the plague's relentless march, leaving behind a stark landscape of abandoned practices, The fundamental human need to explain the unexplainable, to seek control in chaos, and to find solace in ritual. And to find solace in ritual began, ever so slowly, to stir again. It was not a sudden triumphant resurrection of the old ways, but a hesitant, almost melancholic re-engagement, tinged with a darker, more ironic twist. A permanent shadow cast by the brutal lessons of widespread, indiscriminate death. The survivors, those gaunt figures who now populated a vastly emptier world, were still weary, yes. But the sheer monotony of mundane survival eventually permitted a sliver of mental space, a quiet corner of the mind where old anxieties, reshaped by trauma, could once again take root. Consider the pervasive fear of the dead. Before the plague, the specter of an unquiet spirit, a specific revenant, was a potent individual terror, often dealt with by meticulous burial rites or exorcisms. During the plague, the sheer volume of unburied, dishonored dead had numbed this specific fear, rendering it absurd in its scale. If every unhallowed corpse became a ghost, the world would be an endless, chaotic traffic jam of the spectral. But in the aftermath, as the immediate horror subsided into memory, a new, more pervasive, and ironically subtle, form of the fear of the dead began to manifest. It was less about a single angry ghost rattling chains, and more about the quiet, omnipresent awareness of the millions who were naughty there. The abandoned homes, the fallow fields, the silent workshops, these were not merely empty spaces. They were filled with the ghostly absence of their former occupants. This led to a quieter, more internalized reverence, perhaps even a sense of complicity for those who had survived. Superstitions related to the dead therefore became less about warding off malevolent individual spirits, and more about a general, quiet deference to the ubiquitous presence of the departed. A whisper of respect when passing a mass grave, a brief mumbled prayer to a generalized all souls, a reluctance to disturb old burial sites, not out of fear of a specific haunting, but out of a weary acknowledgement of the sheer volume of the unquiet. It was the solemnity of a world still aching from loss, a kind of collective, melancholy agreement to acknowledge the invisible multitude. The interpretation of omens also returned, but with a cynicism that bordered on fatalism. Before, a bad omen was a warning, a chance to intervene with a counter-ritual or a specific prayer. Now, if a black cat crossed your path, or an owl hooted at noon, it was less a call to action and more a grim confirmation of inevitable misfortune. The energy for frantic appeasement had been drained. Instead, there was a weary shrug, a knowing nod, an internal sigh that simply acknowledged, yes, of course, more bad luck. It was an almost ironic acceptance of fate, a quiet "I told you so" to a universe that had so brutally demonstrated its indifference. These new omens were not signals for intervention, but rather a kind of dark cosmic humor, a bleak validation of the ongoing absurdity of existence. The specific ritual to ward off the evil eye might still be performed, but with less fervent conviction and more of a tired, well, it can't make things any worse attitude. The emotional investment was minimal, the mental energy expended reduced to a whisper. Charms and amulets, too, slowly reappeared, but their power was reinterpreted. No longer were they seen as potent shields against divine wrath or absolute protectors against all ill. Instead, they became more like comfort objects, small, personal tokens of a desperate, quiet hope. The rabbit's foot, the lucky coin, the worn fragment of bond thieves were clutched not with zealous belief in their magical efficacy, but with a weary, almost pathetic longing for a tiny, personal slice of luck in a world that had proven overwhelmingly unlucky. Their function shifted from active warding to passive reassurance, a small quiet rebellion against the crushing weight of randomness. The energy required to maintain these beliefs was low. It was a simple, personal act, not a demanding public performance. You didn't need to believe in a full theology of magic for a worn pebble to offer a momentary sense of calm in a chaotic world. It was less about why making things happen, and more about hoping things wouldn't get worse. The church, slowly rebuilding its shattered ranks and infrastructure, found itself in a paradoxical position, while its formal theology remained unchanged. The collective experience of the plague had, for many, irrevocably altered their relationship with organized religion. People returned to churches, not always with the former fervent zeal, but with a mixture of quiet resignation, lingering fear, and a desperate hope for normalcy. The demanding public displays of piety, the endless flagellations, the constant processions, these largely faded. The energy for such physically and emotionally draining demonstrations of faith had been spent. Instead, there was a quieter, more personal piety, often mixed with a pragmatic approach. Prayers might be mumbled, but the expectation of immediate, miraculous intervention was vastly diminished. Saints were still invoked, but perhaps with a weary humor, a sense of asking a friend for a favor they might or might not be able to deliver, rather than demanding a divine right. The relationship became less about an intricate contract of sin and salvation, and more about a quiet, often cynical, plea for basic mercy. The very concept of good fortune also took on a darker hue. Before the plague, good fortune might be attributed to divine favor or proper adherence to rituals. After, it was often seen as an inexplicable, almost insulting anomaly. Why had we survived when my entire family perished? This question, often unvoiced, led to a kind of survivor's guilt, a sense that one's good fortune was less a blessing and more a cosmic oversight, a cruel twist of fate. The old superstitions around bringing good luck were still there, but performed with less joy and more of a quiet, almost fearful gratitude for not being dead. The energy for celebratory rituals had diminished. Instead, there was a pervasive sense of caution, a quiet understanding that good fortune was fleeting, inexplicable, and often suspiciously undeserved. This slow, weary re-emergence of superstition was not a sign of a return to the pre-plague intensity. It was a testament to the human spirit's inability to fully abandon the search for meaning. Even when utterly exhausted, the superstitions that lingered, or slowly returned, were those that required less spiritual energy, less fervent conviction, and more of a quiet, almost cynical resignation. They were the shadows of old beliefs, stripped of their vibrant colors and grand promises, now performed with a weary shrug, a knowing sigh, and a profound, bone-deep understanding of the universe's ultimate indifference. The plague had not eradicated superstition, but it had drained it of its passionate, demanding energy, leaving behind a quieter, darker, and profoundly more ironic landscape of belief. The world was still full of the unseen, perhaps, but the living were simply too tired to care as much, to invest as heavily or to believe as fervently as before. The echoes of old fears remained, but they were hushed, like whispers in an empty hall. For the people had, quite literally, run out of the energy to scream. 14. The stories we tell ourselves, the quiet that eventually fell across the decimated landscapes of Europe, was not the quiet of peace, nor even the hushed reverence of mourning that once filled a church. It was, instead, a profound, almost echoing silence, born of an exhaustion so bone-deep it seemed to have seeped into the very stones of abandoned buildings and the fallow earth of untended fields. The human spirit, having been stretched, contorted, and ultimately battered into a state of profound weariness by the relentless, indiscriminate brutality of the Black Death, had, for a time, simply ceased its elaborate dance with the unseen. The fervent prayers, the desperate blame, the meticulous ritual saw these energetic manifestations of a need to explain the unexplainable had collapsed, not under intellectual refutation, but under the sheer, crushing weight of their demonstrable futility and the exhaustion of their practitioners. Yet, even in this profound weariness, in this desolate aftermath, a peculiar and persistent human compulsion lingered, a whisper that refused to be entirely silenced, the need to tell stories. Before the plague, the stories humanity told itself were grand, intricate affairs woven with threads of divine intervention, cosmic justice, and personal sin. Every rustle of leaves was a whisper from a spirit, every ill fortune a specific punishment, every cure a miraculous intervention. These narratives, whether sanctioned by the church or simmering in the cauldron of ancient folk belief, provided a comforting, if often terrifying, structure to an otherwise chaotic existence. They explained why children died, why crops failed, why fortunes turned. They offered a path to influence fate, however tenuous, through prayer, charm, or penance. They were demanding stories, certainly, requiring constant vigilance, relentless interpretation, and often arduous physical and spiritual labor to maintain. But they were, in their own way, a profound act of coping, a collective narrative that allowed a profoundly vulnerable people to believe they understood, and could perhaps even influence, their place in a vast, unknowable universe. Then came the plague, and the old stories, like rickety scaffolding around a grand but structurally unsound cathedral, began to crumble. The narrative of divine punishment faltered when the most pious perished alongside the most dissolute. The story of specific omens lost its plot when every sign, every shadow, every cough pointed relentlessly to the same singular, horrifying conclusion: death, indiscriminate and inescapable. The heroic tale of the flagellant, sacrificing his body for the collective soul, ended not in triumph, but in a final, black-spotted collapse. The very energy required to maintain these elaborate, demanding, and ultimately disproven narratives simply evaporated. The mind, faced with an overwhelming reality that refused to conform to any pre-existing plot, defaulted to a stark, almost primal simplicity: survive if you can, bury the dead if you must, and above all, try not to die. The luxury of weaving intricate, morally complex tales of cosmic intent had been consumed by the raw, brutal practicality of existence. But even in this exhaustion, this raw, stripped-down reality, the impulse to narrate did not entirely vanish. It merely transformed, twisting into something darker, more ironic, and profoundly more weary. The stories that emerged from the ashes were not grand epics of faith or fear, but quiet, often bitter, personal anecdotes of survival, of loss, of the sheer, absurd randomness of it all. They were the stories of a man who drank himself insensible every night and lived, while his teetotaling, church-going neighbor died. They were the tales of a village that locked its gates against all outsiders and was spared, while the next valley, overflowing with piety and open arms, became a silent charnel house. These were not stories of divine order, but of cosmic indifference, of fate dealt by a blind, uncaring hand. They were less about why and more about why what happened, and wasn't it absurd? This new form of storytelling, born of weariness, required less spiritual energy. It didn't demand constant interpretation of omens, nor did it require arduous rituals of appeasement. It was a simpler, more cynical narrative. Life was a gamble, the rules were unknown, and every precaution, whether prayers or practicalities, was merely a roll of the dice. Superstitions did not vanish entirely, as we've seen, but they re-emerged as lingering shadows, as quieter, less demanding beliefs. A charm might be worn, not with fervent conviction in its protective power, but with a weary shrug, a small, almost pathetic hope for a tiny edge in an unwinnable game. It became a personal, almost private narrative of comfort, rather than a demanding public drama. The energy for such elaborate, socially sanctioned narratives had been spent. And here, in our own moment, as we lean into the whispers of a hollow midnight, we engage in our own form of storytelling, a meta-narrative about their ancient, exhausted one. We, too, are grappling with the unexplainable, with the incomprehensible scale of past suffering. We seek to impose structure, to find meaning, to draw lessons from the chaotic, tragic events of history. We tell ourselves the story of how the plague made people too tired to be superstitious. And in doing so, we are not so different from the medieval peasant muttering a quiet prayer for luck, or the weary survivor recounting the bizarre circumstances of their survival. Our story, framed with dry wit and historical detail, is our way of making sense of their way of making sense or failing to. It's our modern ritual of understanding, our way of coping with the enduring mystery of human resilience and vulnerability. The grim humor lies in the persistent human need for a narrative, even when that narrative is stripped bare of all comfort. Reduced to the bleak absurdity of a big doctor lancing a bubo, or the quiet, almost indifferent surrender of a continent to a microscopic foe. It is the comedy of coping, the inherent absurdity of the human spirit refusing to simply exist in meaninglessness, even when utterly exhausted. The medieval mind, in its weary embrace of a more pragmatic, less demanding form of belief, was perhaps just finding a new, less energy-intensive story to tell itself. It was the story of quiet endurance, of life lived on the ragged edge, of a world so broken it could no longer sustain the grand dramatic fictions it once held so dear. The old tales of saints and devils, of omens and portents, had been screamed and prayed into exhaustion, leaving behind only the hushed, almost imperceptible murmur of a humanity too weary for anything but the truth of its own survival, however brutal and unadorned. And in that quiet, tired truth, a new kind of story, one born of profound exhaustion, found its voice. 15. The end of the world, or just Tuesday? The Black Death, having ripped through the very fabric of medieval European life with the brutal indifference of a cosmic scythe, eventually receded, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. The screams had ceased, the death carts no longer rattled through the streets with their grim cargo, and the church bells, if they rang at all, did so with a weary, almost apologetic clang. What remained was a landscape of desolation, certainly, but also a new, peculiar stillness in the collective human spirit. The frantic, almost hyperactive energy that had once fueled a world drenched in omens. Frantic prayers and furious blame had simply, utterly been consumed. And in this vast, exhausted quiet, a strange, darkly humorous question began to echo in the hollowed-out minds of the survivors. Was that it? Was that the end of the world? The fiery, pestilential apocalypse foretold in scriptures? Or was it, in the grand, relentless, and often rather unglamorous scheme of things, just another Tuesday? For centuries, the medieval world had lived under the shadow of the apocalypse. Visions of the four horsemen, of divine judgment, of the earth consumed by fire and brimstone, were not abstract theological concepts but vivid, palpable fears woven into the very fabric of daily life. Every famine, every war, every earthquake, every strange celestial event was meticulously scrutinized for its apocalyptic significance, interpreted as a prelude to the final terrifying curtain call. The human mind, so eager to find meaning in suffering, had a ready-made narrative for ultimate catastrophe. And then the Black Death arrived. It was indiscriminate, relentless, universal. It swept away kings and beggars, saints and sinners, with equal horrifying efficiency. It brought pestilence and death on a scale unimaginable. It broke down societal structures, silenced churches, and transformed bustling cities into charnel houses. If ever there was an event that screamed end of the world, this was it. But the funny thing about the end of the world, when it actually arrives, is that it often feels less like a grand dramatic finale and more like an unending, exhausting grind. The survivors, those gaunt figures who now picked their way through the ruins of their former lives, were not gazing upwards, awaiting the trumpet call of angels or the descent of wrathful deities. They were too tired for such theatrical anticipation. Their apocalyptic vision had been replaced by the mundane, brutal reality of finding food, burying yet another neighbor, trying to replant fallow fields, and perhaps, just perhaps, finding a quiet corner to simply sit and breathe without the fear of immediate contagion. The energy for a full-scale, sustained existential dread had been utterly drained, leaving behind only the weary, quiet focus on the next, entirely unglamorous. Consider the practicalities. If it truly were the end of days, then what was the point of mending a roof, or haggling over the price of a chicken, or worrying about who would inherit a plot of land? Yet, these were precisely the concerns, however muted, that began to reassert themselves. The survivors, through sheer unheroic force of habit and the relentless pressure of basic needs, began to do the things that humans do when faced with profound loss. They started to rebuild. However slowly, however imperfectly. They buried the dead, not always with reverence, but with a desperate pragmatism to clear the stench. They tried to cultivate the land, for starvation, it turned out, was another very real, very present threat. Apocalypse or no he. They sought out what few remaining family members they could find, for loneliness was another heavy burden. This wasn't the glorious, defiant act of a chosen few rebuilding civilization. It was the quiet, almost indifferent grunt of a species too weary to do anything but continue. The old superstitions, the elaborate rituals that had once demanded so much spiritual energy, were simply too tiring to fully resurrect. The wellspring of passionate belief in their efficacy had run dry. Why spend hours meticulously reading omens when the grandest omen of all had delivered an indiscriminate death sentence? Why perform complex counter-rituals when the most powerful charms had failed to protect? The minds of the survivors, stripped bare by trauma, preferred the stark, unvarnished reality. A fever meant sickness, not necessarily divine punishment. A cough meant danger, not a demon. The lingering shadows of superstition remained, certainly, but they were quieter, less demanding. They were the small, almost involuntary gestures of habit, a muttered prayer, a quiet aversion, performed not with fervent conviction, but with a weary shrug, a kind of "it can't hurt, and I'm too tired to care much either way" attitude. The dramatic, energy-consuming dance with the divine had been replaced by a slow, plodding march towards the next day. The plague, in its brutal irony, had not led to a dramatic intellectual awakening or a sudden shift to rationalism, at least not immediately. Rather, it had induced a profound, collective exhaustion that rendered the energetic pursuit of superstition, blame, and even fear an unbearable burden. The medieval world hadn't actively rejected the idea of an apocalypse. It had simply grown too tired to fully believe in one that felt so much like an endless, agonizing Tuesday. The grandeur of the end of days, with its clear moral reckoning and its dramatic finality, was a luxury that a populace decimated by death and burdened by the sheer, unglamorous mechanics of survival simply could not afford. There was no time for grand theological debates when one was hauling bodies, no energy for philosophical angst when one was scrounging for a piece of bread. And so, the world continued, diminished, altered, but very much still there. The people who populated it were, for a time, less prone to frantic, demanding superstitions, not because they had become enlightened, but because they had become, quite literally, too tired. They had faced the ultimate horror, and it had proven not to be a dramatic, purifying fire, but a relentless, insidious draining of life, energy, and the very capacity for complex, demanding belief. The Black Death, perhaps, was not the end of the world, but a particularly brutal, extended Tuesday, a lesson in the grim, unglamorous persistence of humanity, even when utterly, bone-deep, existentially exhausted. The world kept turning, slowly, wearily, but turning nonetheless, leaving the grand apocalypses for the storytellers of a less fatigued future. All that remained was the quiet, often ironic, understanding that life, no matter how brutal, somehow finds a way to grind on.